What if Bran Stark never fell from the tower? A Throne Tales script. Full story. What if Bran Stark didn't climb that day? Not because he stopped climbing, not because he learned caution or developed a sudden respect for gravity or listened to his mother, who had been telling him to stop climbing since he was old enough to reach a handhold. Bran Stark at 7 was a boy made of momentum, the kind of child who saw a vertical surface and felt the pull. The way sailors felt the pull of the horizon, the specific, irresistible attraction of someone whose body understood something his mind hadn't caught up to. He climbed everything. The walls, the towers, the broken tower with the gargoyles that his mother had specifically, repeatedly, with increasing volume and decreasing patience, told him not to climb. He climbed because climbing was what his body wanted, and because the view from the top was... Bran couldn't explain it to anyone. Not his mother, not his father, not even Jon, who came closest to understanding. The view from the top made the world make sense. From the ground, Winterfell was corridors and rooms and the specific confined geography of a child's world. From the rooftops, Winterfell was a map. The whole thing visible at once. The connections between the parts. The shape of the place. He almost climbed on that Tuesday. The king was coming. The whole castle was in motion. The specific, organized chaos of a household preparing for a royal visit. The cleaning and the cooking and the grooming of horses and children that happened when the most powerful man in the realm was expected. Bran had been told to wash and dress and present himself in the courtyard, and not to climb, and not to get dirty, and not to disappear into the upper reaches of the castle, where nobody could find him. He almost climbed anyway. The broken tower was calling him, not literally, not yet, that would come later, but in the way that heights called to Bran, the magnetic pull of the vertical. But his mother caught him. Not at the tower. In the courtyard. Halfway to the broken tower, boots muddy from the shortcut through the godswood, heading for the old stones with the specific, purposeful stride of a 7-year-old who had decided where he was going and who hadn't considered that the route was monitored. Bran. He stopped. Catelyn stood in the doorway to the great hall. She had the expression she had when she'd caught him climbing before. Not angry exactly. Tired. The specific, maternal exhaustion of a woman who had told a child the same thing 400 times, and who was reaching the point where the telling was becoming a performance, rather than an instruction. I wasn't going to climb. You were heading for the broken tower. I was going to look at it. You were going to look at it from the top. He couldn't argue this because she was right, and lying to his mother was something Bran hadn't learned yet. That skill came later, with adolescence and the specific developmental milestone of discovering that parents could be managed. Come inside. Your father wants you cleaned up before King Robert arrives. Bran went inside. He washed. He dressed. He stood in the courtyard with his brothers and sisters and waited for the king. He did not climb the broken tower. He did not see what was happening inside the broken tower. He did not fall. This is the story of what that one uncaught moment. The moment where Catelyn's timing and Bran's route, and the specific geometry of a mother's attention intersecting a child's trajectory, changed. Not the grand sweep of it. Not the armies and the thrones that would come later. The moment. The small, human, domestic moment where a boy didn't climb a tower because his mother told him to wash his face. Everything followed from that. Winterfell. The King's Arrival. 298 AC. Robert Baratheon came through the gates of Winterfell, and the castle held its breath. Not metaphorically, literally. The specific collective inhalation of 500 people who had never seen a king, and who had been told their entire lives that kings were large and golden and magnificent. Robert Baratheon was large. He was not golden. He was not magnificent. He was a man who had been drinking for 15 years, and whose body had been converting muscle to fat at the specific rate that happened when a warrior stopped warring and started sitting, and the conversion was visible in every line of him: the belly, the red face, the armor that didn't fit the way it had when the armor was made. Bran stood in the courtyard line between Arya and Rickon and watched the king dismount and embrace his father with the bone-crushing enthusiasm of a man who loved his friends the way he loved his wine. Completely, physically, without looked down at himself, looked at Ned. Ned didn't smile, then did, the slow Stark smile that was worth more for being rare. Robert laughed. The sound filled the courtyard, the specific acoustic overflow of a large man's laughter in an enclosed space. The tension broke. The household breathed. Bran watched. He watched the king, and he watched the queen, Cersei Lannister, golden, beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful, with the specific polished surface that money and power produced, and that warmth had nothing to do with. She looked at Winterfell the way someone looked at a place they'd been sent to against their will, and that they intended to endure rather than inhabit. He watched Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, golden too, the same gold as his sister, standing in the courtyard with his Kingsguard armor and the expression of a man who found the North personally offensive and who was performing tolerance. He watched Tyrion Lannister, who was short and who was drinking already, and who looked at Winterfell with the specific assessment of a man who processed every new place as a text to be read and who had opinions about the font. He watched Joffrey, the Crown Prince, blonde, 12, with a face that Bran couldn't read because the face was doing something he didn't have a word for yet. Not kindness. Not cruelty. The specific blankness of a child who had learned to perform emotion rather than feel it, and whose performance was convincing to adults and transparent to children. Bran watched all of this from the ground. From the ground, the view was different. From the rooftops, you saw the patterns, the way people moved, the architecture of their relationships visible in the architecture of their positioning. From the ground, you saw the faces, the details, the specific human information that distance obscured. He didn't know that he was developing a skill. He didn't know that the watching, the ground level watching, the face reading, the specific talent for seeing what people were doing behind what they were performing, was the thing that was going to replace the climbing. He was 7. He watched. The feast that night was the feast that Winterfell always produced for important visitors, the specific northern hospitality that expressed itself through volume rather than elegance. The tables groaning with food that was hearty and filling, and that communicated, without words, that the North took care of its guests, even if the North didn't decorate its tables. Bran sat with his siblings. He watched the high table, watched his father and the king drink and talk. The specific physical vocabulary of two men who had been friends for 20 years, and who communicated through shoulder claps and raised cups and the occasional burst of laughter that was too loud and too real, and that the rest of the hall pretended not to notice. He watched his mother, watched Catelyn sit beside the queen, and managed the specific social challenge of entertaining a woman who found the North beneath her and who communicated the finding through the precise calibration of her attention, giving enough to avoid insult and not enough to suggest genuine interest. He watched Sansa, 11, already performing the specific Sansa thing of studying the court visitors for social information, cataloguing the clothing and the manners and the accents with the intensity of a girl who intended to live in that world and who was beginning the preparation. He watched Arya, 9, not performing anything, eating with her fingers when she thought nobody was looking and being caught by Sansa, and being corrected, and not caring about the correction with the specific Arya energy that was not rebellion, but simply the constitutional inability to pretend. He watched Jon, 14, sitting at the side table, not at the high table, with the expression that Jon wore at feasts, which was the expression of someone who was present and excluded simultaneously, and who had learned to manage the exclusion by going somewhere inside himself where the exclusion couldn't reach. Bran saw all of this because Bran was 7, and 7-year-olds saw things that adults missed, because adults were busy performing, and 7-year-olds were busy watching, and watching was the more informative activity. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Not all of it. Not the subtext. Not the specific loaded quality of his mother's conversation with the Queen. Not the complicated grief in his father's drinking with Robert. Not the particular tension between Jaime Lannister and everyone else in the room that was visible to adults as the Kingslayer's reputation, and invisible to adults as the Kingslayer's secret. But he recorded it, the way children recorded things, not in words, in images, in the specific photographic memory of childhood that stored information without organizing it, and that would, later, when the organization came, produce insights that the recording hadn't anticipated. The feast ended. Bran went to bed. He dreamed about a crow. The crow. 298 a sea. The dream was not a normal dream. Bran knew this the way you knew things in dreams, not through reasoning, but through the specific dream logic that operated by different rules than waking logic, and that was, in its own way, more reliable. Normal dreams felt like thinking. This dream felt like seeing. The crow was large, larger than any crow Bran had seen. 3 eyes too, where eyes belonged, and one in the center of the forehead. Open, seeing. The specific focused gaze of a creature that was not a creature, but a Bran didn't have the word. A messenger. A door. A thing that was shaped like a bird, and that contained something that was not bird-shaped. The crow said, "You must learn to fly." Bran said, "I can't fly. I'm not a bird." The crow said, "Not with wings, with eyes." The dream ended. Bran woke up. The room was dark. Winterfell at night, the sound of the hot springs, the distant sound of the night watch, the specific acoustic signature of a castle that had been standing for 8,000 years and that produced its own kind of silence, which was not the absence of sound, but the accumulation of 8,000 years of sounds layered so thick they'd become a texture. Bran lay in bed and thought about He thought, 3 eyes. He thought, fly with eyes. He thought, that doesn't make sense. He went back to sleep. The dream came again the next night, and the night after, and the night after that. The crow patient, persistent, the specific insistent quality of something that had been trying to get through and that was going to keep trying, regardless of whether the recipient. The crow showed him things. Not yet, not the full visions, not the sweeping panoramas of past and future that would come later. Small things. Images. The gods with the heart tree. The face carved in the white wood. The red eyes. The face was watching. Not in the way faces watched in dreams, where the watching was a projection of the dreamer's anxiety. The face was watching in the way that real things watched. With intelligence. With attention. With the specific focused awareness of something that was alive in a way that trees were not supposed to be alive. Bran went to the Godswood. In the morning. In person. He walked across the castle from his rooms to the Godswood Gate and through the gate into the old forest that grew inside Winterfell's walls. The ancient trees and the pool and the heart tree with the face. He stood in front of the face. The face watched, not differently than it had watched yesterday, or the day before that the heart tree's face had been watching for 8,000 years, and the watching didn't change, because a 7-year-old boy was standing in front of it, with a dream about a crow in his head. But Bran felt something. Not a voice. Not words. A direction, the specific non-verbal communication of something very old, reaching towards something very young, and finding the distance manageable. You have the sight. Not heard. Felt, in the specific deep body way that instincts were felt not in the mind, but in the blood, in the bones, in the architecture of the body that predated language, and that communicated in a register that language couldn't reach. Bran stood in front of the heart tree. He was 7 years old, and he was having the experience that, in another version of this story, would have required a fall from a tower and a broken back, and a coma, and the specific traumatic shattering of a childhood to produce. In this version, the experience came anyway. Not through trauma, through the specific natural development of a gift that was in the blood, and that the blood was going to express, regardless of whether the expression was invited. The Starks had the green sight. Not all of them, not in every generation. But the blood carried it the way rivers carried water, not always visible on the surface, but present in the current. And when the conditions were right when a child was born, with the right combination of the old blood and the old attention, and the specific receptivity that was not training, but temperament the green sight surfaced, Bran had the right combination. He didn't know this. He knew he had dreams about a crow. He knew the Godswood felt different when he stood in it. He knew that sometimes, when he was very still, when the world around him was quiet enough that the noise of living stopped interfering with the noise of whatever was underneath living, he could feel things, directions, presences, the specific awareness of a landscape that was not physical and that was nonetheless real. He told nobody. Not because he was afraid, because he didn't have the words. How do you tell your father that the trees are watching you? How do you tell your mother that a 3-eyed crow visits you in dreams and tells you to fly with your eyes? The vocabulary of a 7-year-old did not include the terminology required to describe what was happening, and the gap between the experience and the language produced a silence that was not secrecy, but incapacity. The dreams continued. The sight developed. Bran went to the Godswood every morning, and in King's Landing, 300 miles south, his father was walking into a city that was going to try to kill him. And the thing that had started the killing in another version of this story, the fall, the assassination attempt, the dagger, the specific chain of escalating crises that turned a political murder into a civil war, didn't happen because a boy stayed on the ground. The powder keg was still there. The match just hadn't struck. Yet. King's Landing. Ned without the crisis. 298 AC. Ned went south. He went because Robert asked, and because Jon Arryn was dead, and because Ned Stark did not refuse calls to duty, which was both the quality that made him the man Robert needed, and the quality that would eventually be tested past its breaking point. But he went differently. In another version of this story, Ned went south, carrying two crises, the political crisis of being named Hand, and the personal crisis of his son, lying broken in a bed in Winterfell. The personal crisis made the political one worse. It distracted him, divided his attention, produced the specific emotional vulnerability of a father operating in a dangerous environment, while his mind was 800 miles north with a child who might die. In this version, Ned went south carrying one crisis. Bran was fine. Bran was climbing trees and annoying his mother and being a 7-year-old boy, which was what 7-year-old boys did, and the not worrying freed approximately 40% of Ned's cognitive capacity that had, in another timeline, been consumed by grief and fear. The 40% mattered. Ned arrived in King's Landing with Sansa and Arya, and a household of northern men, and the specific determined posture of a man who was walking into a situation he didn't want, and who was going to handle it through the application of northern honor to southern corruption, which was a strategy that had historically produced mixed results, but that was the only strategy Ned possessed. The city was, Ned looked at it with the eyes of a man who had been there twice before, and who had hated it both times. The smell, the noise, the density of human life pressed into streets that were too narrow for the traffic, and that produced the specific claustrophobic atmosphere of a city that had been built for 100,000 and that housed 500,000. He went to the Red Keep. He took the Hand's office. He sat at the desk that Jon Arryn had died at, and he looked at the papers and the ledgers and the specific accumulated evidence of 14 years of governance that Jon Arryn had been conducting, and that had ended, the official account said, with a sudden illness. Ned did not believe the official account. Not because of evidence, he had no evidence. The specific Stark instinct that was not intelligence exactly, but was adjacent to intelligence, the pattern recognition that operated below the level of conscious analysis, and that said, this is wrong. The timing, the circumstances, the specific way that Jon Arryn's death had been described by people who described it with the rehearsed quality of a story that had been prepared before the asking. Ned began to investigate. He did it the Ned way directly, without subtlety, with the specific blunt instrument approach that southern politicians found either admirable or suicidal, depending on whether they were the subject of the investigation or the observer. He talked to the Grand Maester. Pycelle's account of Jon Arryn's death was, Ned noted this, too comprehensive, too detailed. The specific over-documentation that happened when someone was describing something they'd rehearsed rather than remembered. Real memories had gaps. Pycelle's account had none. He talked to Varys. Varys was Ned couldn't read Varys. Varys was the one person in the Red Keep whose surface was so thoroughly managed that Ned's instinct couldn't find the person underneath the performance. Varys gave him information. The information was useful. Whether the information was true was a different question, and the difference between useful and true was one that Ned was not naturally equipped to navigate. He talked to Littlefinger, Lord Petter Baelish, Master of Coin, a man Ned had met once before at Riverrun years ago, when Baelish was a boy with a crush on Catelyn Tully and a scar from Bran Stark's sword. The boy was gone. What remained was a man who smiled too easily, and who offered help too readily, and who triggered Ned's instinct the way an off note triggered a musician. You couldn't explain what was wrong, but you knew something was. Baelish said Jon Arryn was investigating something before he died. Ned said, "What?" The king's children. Baelish leaned forward, dropping his voice to the specific conspiratorial register that he used when he was performing trustworthiness. which was, Ned didn't know this yet, the register Baelish used when the truth being offered was real, but the motivation for offering it was not. Jon Arryn was reading a specific book, a genealogy, the lineages of the great houses. He was tracking the Baratheon bloodline. Why? Because the Baratheon bloodline is consistent. Black hair, blue eyes, in every generation. Every Baratheon for 300 years. Every legitimate Baratheon. Ned looked at him. The king's children are blonde, Baelish said. All three. Blonde hair, green eyes, Lannister coloring. Not a single trait from their father's line. The information landed. In another version of this story, this information arrived mixed with the crisis of Bran's fall and the Dagger and Catelyn's journey south and Tyrion's arrest and the escalating cascade of emergencies that made every piece of information feel urgent and that produced the specific decision-making environment where Ned A., man who was good at thinking slowly and carefully, was forced to think fast and recklessly. In this version, the information arrived alone, clean, without the background noise of a son in a coma and a wife in a panic. Ned received the information, and he did what he should have done, what he couldn't do in the other timeline. Because the other timeline didn't give him the time he sat with it. He sat with it for 3 days. During those 3 days, he didn't arrest anyone. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't tell anyone what he was thinking. He sat in the Hand's office, and he read the book that Jon Arryn had been, reading the lineages and histories of the great houses of the 7 kingdoms, and he tracked what Jon Arryn had tracked. And he arrived at the same conclusion, and he let the conclusion settle into his understanding. The waystones settled into riverbeds, slowly, thoroughly, with the specific gravity of something heavy finding its place. The conclusion, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not Robert's children. They were Jaime Lannister's, the Queen, and her brother. Twins. The specific abomination that the faith condemned, and that the realm would condemn, and that was the most dangerous secret in the 7 kingdoms. Because the secret's exposure would delegitimize the throne, and the throne's delegitimization would produce Ned could see this, could project the consequences the way he projected military, the chain of events unspooling from the reveal like fire from a fuse war. Rebellion, the specific catastrophic upheaval that happened when the foundation of a government was discovered to be fraudulent. Ned understood the weight of what he held. In another timeline, this understanding was compromised by urgency. The urgency of Bran, the urgency of Catelyn, the urgency of a situation that was accelerating faster than Ned's methodical mind could process. In this timeline, the understanding was not uncompromised. Nothing in King's Landing was uncompromised, but less compromised. Cleaner. Ned had the time to sit with the weight and to decide what to do with the weight, rather than being forced to act before the deciding was done. He decided to do something he had never done before. He decided to be political. Ned's investigation. The Slow Way. 298 AC. He went to Robert's bastards first. Not to confront, to verify. The specific, methodical approach of a man who understood, for the first time in his life, forced by the circumstances into understanding, that holding a weapon required knowing the weapon was real before aiming it. Gendry was in the Street of Steel, the blacksmith's apprentice, 15 years old, black hair, blue eyes, the Baratheon jaw, the Baratheon build, already large at 15, the raw physical architecture that Robert's body had carried before the drinking converted it. Ned looked at Gendry. He looked at Joffrey. The comparison was, it was not subtle. Gendry was Robert's son the way a painting was a copy of the original, the features reproduced with the specific fidelity that blood produced. Joffrey was not. Joffrey was golden and angular, and the face had nothing in it that was Robert, and everything in it that was Lannister. And the difference between Gendry's face and Joffrey's face was the difference between a legitimate heir and a fraudulent one. Ned went to the other bastards. 3 of them that he could find in King's Landing. Gendry, a girl named Barra, infant, dark-haired, blue-eyed, and a boy of 6 whose mother was a woman in flea bottom. Every one of them had Robert's colouring. Every one of them had the Baratheon features. None of Robert's acknowledged children did. The evidence was not legal proof. The evidence was pattern. The kind of pattern that Ned understood because patterns were what military intelligence was built on. Enough data points to suggest a conclusion, not enough to guarantee it. In a court of law, the evidence would be challenged. In a political conversation, the evidence was overwhelming. Ned needed allies. This was the hard part, the part that required Ned to do the thing that Ned was worst at, which was trust people he didn't know for reasons he couldn't verify. Northern honor did not prepare you for the specific challenge of building alliances in a city where everyone's loyalty was conditional, and where the conditions were invisible until you triggered them. He didn't go to Baelish. This was the critical decision. In another timeline, in the timeline where Bran fell and Catelyn came south, and Catelyn's childhood connection to Littlefinger produced the specific misplaced trust that led to the disaster, Ned went to Baelish, because Catelyn told him to. In this timeline, Catelyn was in Winterfell. Catelyn's trust in Baelish was not present to override Ned's instinct, and Ned's instinct said, this man smiles too easily, and the smiling is work. Ned went to Stannis, not to Stannis directly, to Stannis' representative in King's Landing, because Stannis himself had left the city months ago, withdrawn to Dragonstone with a specific Stannis gesture of departure that was both strategic retreat and moral statement. Stannis had left because Jon Arryn was dead, and because Stannis knew what Jon Arryn had discovered, and because Stannis' response to knowing a dangerous truth was to leave the proximity of the danger rather than manage it, which was the specific Stannis approach to problems, correct in principle, useless in practice. The representative was a knight, Sir Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, a former smuggler, who had been knighted by Stannis for running an onion ship through a siege, and who had lost half his fingers for the smuggling that made the running possible. Because Stannis was the kind of man who rewarded and punished the same act, and who found no contradiction in doing both. Davos was Ned read him immediately, which was rare in King's Landing honest. Not the practiced performance of honesty that courtiers deployed, not the strategic deployment of apparent candor. Honest, the real thing. A man whose face matched his words, because the face and the words came from the same place. Lord Arryn knew, Davos said, about the Queen's children. Stannis knows? Stannis has known for months. He left the city because knowing and being in the city was Lord Stannis has a specific approach to risk. The approach being, leave. The approach being, remove himself from a situation where the knowledge is actionable and where acting on it would produce consequences he can't control. Davos looked at Ned with the assessment of a man who had spent his life evaluating whether other men could be trusted, and who had developed the skill through the specific education of the smuggling trade, where trusting the wrong person got you killed. You're going to act on it. I'm going to. Ned stopped. He had been about to say tell Robert. The Ned Stark reflex, find the truth, present the truth, let the truth produce its consequences. I'm going to figure out what acting on it looks like. That's more cautious than I expected from a Stark. I've had time to think. Time to think is unusual. In this city. I know. I'm using it before it runs out. Ned wrote to Stannis. A direct letter, sealed, sent by Rider rather than Raven, because ravens could be intercepted, and the information in this letter was the most dangerous information in the Seven Kingdoms. The letter said, I have verified what Jon Arryn found. I intend to act. I need your support. Come to King's Landing. Not with an army, with your presence. As Robert's legitimate heir, your presence changes the political calculation. Stannis wrote back. The reply was Stannis, terse, unambiguous, carrying the specific Stannis quality of stripping every communication to its essential components and discarding the rest as wasteful. Coming. 2 weeks. Do nothing before I arrive. Ned did nothing. For 2 weeks, Ned Stark, the most impatient man in a patient man's body, did nothing. He attended the small council meetings. He managed the governance. He dealt with the budget, which was a catastrophe. 6 million gold dragons owed to the Lannisters and the Iron Bank, the specific financial architecture of a kingdom that had been spending more than it earned for 15 years, and that was approximately 2 bad harvests from insolvency. He endured Cersei's presence at court, which required looking at a woman he now knew was committing incest and treason, and performing normalcy with the specific grinding effort that only Ned Stark could have found exhausting, because only Ned Stark would have found the performing more difficult than the knowing. He watched Jaime Lannister. Now that he knew, the knowing changed what he saw. Jaime in the throne room, the Kingslayer, golden, standing in his white armor with the specific, beautiful arrogance of a man who had been the best at everything his whole life, and who had never had to develop the social skills that lesser men developed to compensate for lesser abilities. Jaime looked at Cersei. The looking was... Ned could see it now. The look that was not the look a brother gave a sister, but the look a man gave a woman he was involved with. The specific, heated quality that was invisible if you weren't looking for it, and obvious if you were. Ned looked away. He waited for Stannis. Catelyn, Winterfell without crisis. 298 AC. In Winterfell, Catelyn Stark was managing a household, not a crisis, a household. The distinction was everything. In another version of this story, Catelyn was managing a comatose child and the specific, catastrophic aftermath of an assassination attempt, and the rage and the fear and the journey south that the rage and fear produced. In this version, Catelyn was managing supply orders and servant schedules and the education of 5 children who were, with the exception of Arya, who was always the exception, progressing through childhood at the expected rate. Bran was fine. He was climbing, which she hated. He was eating, which she appreciated. He was attending lessons with Maester Luwin, which he found boring, and training in the yard with Sir Roderick, which he loved. He was being 7. The only unusual thing was the Godswood. Bran had started going to the Godswood every morning. Not with Ned. Ned was south. Not with anyone. Alone, a 7-year-old boy walking into the old God's forest before breakfast and standing in front of the heart tree for Catelyn had timed it between 20 minutes and an hour. She asked about it. What do you do in the Godswood? I sit. You sit. With the tree. Why? Bran's face did the thing that children's faces did when they were trying to describe something they didn't have words for. The scrunching. The searching. It's calm there. The tree is calm. Trees are generally calm, Bran. They don't move. This one does. Not moving. More like listening. Catelyn looked at her son. She was a Tully. She worshipped the 7. The old gods were Ned's the Weirwoods, the Heart Trees, the specific ancient religion that the North maintained and that the South had abandoned, and that Catelyn found, if she was honest with herself, slightly unsettling. The face in the tree. The red eyes. The sense of being watched by something that was not human, and that did not operate on human timelines. Be careful in the Godswood. Of what? Of I don't know. Be careful. Okay, he went to the Godswood the next morning. And the next. And the next. Catelyn watched and worried and decided that a child who sat with trees was preferable to a child who climbed towers, and that the worrying was manageable. Robb helped. Robb was 14, the eldest son, the heir. The boy who was Catelyn saw this with the specific pride and anxiety that mothers felt about children who were becoming adults, becoming a lord. Not yet a lord. Becoming one. The process visible in the posture and the voice, and the specific way that Robb was beginning to handle the responsibilities that Ned's absence had deposited on his shoulders. He managed the household guard. He heard petitions, small ones, the village disputes and boundary arguments that were below the Lord's attention and that fell to the heir when the Lord was absent. He did this with the specific Robb quality of charisma, applied to governance, the ability to make people feel heard even when the hearing produced an outcome they didn't want. The talent that Ned lacked, and that Catelyn had spent 20 years providing as a supplement to Ned's deficiency. Jon was gone. Jon had gone to the wall to the Night's Watch, to take the black, to find the specific place in the world that was available to a bastard who loved his family, but who understood that the family's architecture didn't include a position for him. He'd left before the king arrived, which Catelyn was. She acknowledged this to herself, in the private hours, in the specific honest self-assessment that she conducted in the Godswood, because the Godswood was where private things happened in Winterfell relieved about. Jon's departure simplified the household. The simplification was a relief. The relief was something Catelyn felt guilty about. The guilt was something she managed by not examining it too closely. Theon was present. Theon Greyjoy, the ward, the hostage, the specific human evidence of the political arrangement between the Starks and the Iron Islands that required a Greyjoy child in Winterfell as collateral. Theon was 19, and he was. Catelyn watched him the way she watched everything in Winterfell, restless. The specific restlessness of a young man who had been in someone else's house for 10 years, and who was beginning to feel the weight of the 10 years as a ceiling rather than a shelter. The household ran. Catelyn ran it, and in the godswood, every morning, a 7-year-old boy sat with a tree, and the tree told him things that trees were not supposed to tell. And the boy absorbed the telling the way 7-year-olds absorbed everything completely, without resistance, with the specific openness that children had, and that adults had trained out of themselves, because the openness was inconvenient. The visions came. Bran. What the sight showed. To see. The first real vision came on a Thursday morning. Not the dreams. Those had been coming for weeks. The three-eyed crow, the recurring images, the specific nighttime communication that operated in the language of metaphor and symbol. This was different. Bran was awake, sitting in front of the heart tree, eyes open, and the vision came through the waking, through the open eyes, through a channel that was not dream and not imagination, but something else. He saw the south. He saw King's Landing, a city he had never been to, that he knew only from lessons and descriptions, rendered now in the specific high-definition clarity of green sight, which was not visual in the way that normal sight was visual, but which produced images that were more real than sight, because the images carried information that sight didn't carry. Emotion, intention, the specific underlying truth of what was happening beneath what was visible. He saw his father. Ned was in an office, a large office, papers on the desk, the hand of the king's badge on his chest. He was reading a book, a thick book, and his face was... Bran didn't have the vocabulary, but the feeling was clear. His father was carrying something heavy. Not physically. The kind of heavy that lived in the mind and that bent the posture, and that was visible to a 7-year-old looking through a tree, because 7-year-olds saw the weight even when adults couldn't see it in themselves. He saw the Queen. Cersei Lannister, in a room, a bedchamber, rich, golden, the specific aesthetic of a woman whose environment was an extension of her self-presentation. And beside her, Bran's mind stuttered, the way minds stuttered when they encountered information that didn't fit the available categories. Beside her was her brother, Jaime, the Kingslayer. And they were. Bran was 7, and the specific nature of what they were doing was outside his experiential vocabulary. But the tree knew. The tree showed him the shape of the truth without the details. The Queen and her brother. Together. In a way that brothers and sisters were not supposed to be together. Bran pulled out of the vision. Not voluntarily, the vision expelled him, the way you were expelled from deep water when your lungs demanded air. He was sitting in front of the heart tree, breathing hard, his hands on the roots, the morning cold on his face. He thought, the Queen and the Kingslayer. He thought, my father is carrying something heavy. He thought, these are connected. He was 7. He didn't understand the connection, not the mechanics, not the politics, not the specific cascade of implications that the connection produced. But he understood that the connection existed, and that the connection was dangerous, and that his father was in the middle of it. He told Maester Luwin. Not the vision specifically, he didn't know how to describe the vision in terms that a maester would accept. He told Luwin about the dreams, about the three-eyed crow, about the feeling in the godswood. Luwin listened. Luwin was of all the adults in Bran's life, the one whose response to unusual information was the most calibrated. Not dismissive, not credulous, analytical. The specific maester response to new data, which was, catalogue it, cross-reference it, determine whether it fits existing frameworks, or whether the frameworks need expanding. The green sight, Luwin said. Not a question, a classification. What's green sight? An old gift. The children of the forest had it the ability to see through the weirwoods, to perceive events at a distance, to receive visions. Luwin adjusted his chain, the specific habitual gesture of a man who processed information through the physical manipulation of his academic insignia. The Starks have the old blood. The first men. The green sight has appeared in the Stark line before. Rarely, unpredictably. Is it real? The maesters disagree. The Citadel's official position is that green sight is historical, meaning it existed once and doesn't exist now. My position is Luwin paused, not for drama, for accuracy. My position is that I've been at Winterfell for 15 years, And I've seen things in this castle that the Citadel's official position doesn't account for. The direwolves, the hot springs, the specific way that the weirwood in the godswood is. He stopped. I don't have the vocabulary either. Alive? Lewin looked at Bran. Tell your mother, Lewin said. Not the details, the fact. That you're seeing things, that the visions are vivid, and that they correspond to real events. How do you know they correspond to real events? Because your face, right now, tells me that you've seen something that frightened you, and that the frightening is not the kind that dreams produce. Dreams produce the fright of the imagined. Your fright is the fright of the real. Bran told Catelyn. He told her in the Godswood, because the Godswood was where the telling needed to happen, where the old gods were present, and where the telling would carry the weight that the telling required. He said, I can see things. Catelyn's face, he said, through the trees, through the heart tree. I can see places, people, things that are happening far away. Bran, I saw Father, in King's Landing, at his desk. He was reading a book. His face was... He was worried, Mother. He was worried about something. Catelyn's face changed. Not from disbelief to belief. From attention to the specific, focused attention that a mother applied. When her child said something that was either concerning for psychological reasons or concerning for real reasons, and the distinction required investigation. What was he reading? A big book, with names, families. Bran hesitated. The next part was the part he didn't have words for, and that the not having words was going to make difficult. And I saw the Queen. The Queen, with her brother, Shaime. They were... He stopped. I don't know how to say it. Then don't say it. They were together. The way married people are together. But they're not married. They're... Catelyn held up a hand. She sat down. On the root of the heart tree. The root was cold, and the moss was damp, and sitting on the root of a sacred tree was not something Catelyn Tully would normally do. But the moment required, sitting because standing was no longer functional. She looked at her son. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about it the way she thought about all information. Practically, systematically, with the specific Tully approach that filtered emotion through analysis before allowing the emotion to affect the response. Tell me exactly what you saw, Bran told her. Everything. The crow, the dreams, the heart tree, the visions, the Queen and the Kingslayer, his father and the book, the weight on his father's face. Catelyn sat with it. She sat with it for a long time. Then she stood. We're writing to your father. Tonight. The letter. What Catelyn sent. 298 AC. The letter went by Ryder. Not Raven. Catelyn was Tully, and Tullys understood that ravens could be intercepted, and that the information in this letter was the kind that killed people who carried it. The Ryder was Jory Cassell, the captain of the household guard, a man whose loyalty was constitutional rather than transactional, the kind of loyalty that existed because the person carrying it could not conceive of an alternative. Jory rode south at speed with a sealed letter in his saddlebag and instructions to place the letter in Ned Stark's hand and no other. The letter said, Ned, Bran is different. I don't have the right words. He's having visions. Through the weirwoods. The green site. Lewin says the Starks carry it in the blood and Bran has it. I know how this sounds. I worship the Seven, and I am telling you that your son is seeing things through a tree, and the things he's seeing are real. He's seen you, at your desk, reading a book about lineages. He's seen the Queen, with her brother, together. The way he described it. I didn't let him finish describing it. He's 7. But the implication is clear, and if it's true, then the thing you're investigating is confirmed by a source that neither the Lannisters nor anyone in King's Landing can anticipate or counter. Be careful. Whatever you're doing, be more careful. Bran can see, but he can't see everything, and the gaps in the seeing are where the danger lives. Come home. When you can. Come home. The letter reached King's Landing in 8 days. Ned read it in his solar, read it twice, set it down. He stood at the window and looked at the city. He thought, the green site. He thought, my 7-year-old son is seeing through the weirwoods, and what he's seeing confirms everything I've been investigating for a month. He thought, Catelyn believes it. Catelyn, who worships the Seven, who has never in her life credited the old gods with anything more than historical significance, believes it enough to send a rider. He thought, is this the confirmation changed the investigation? Not the conclusion was already reached, the evidence was already assembled, the pattern of Robert's bastards and the lineage book and the Baratheon colouring was already clear enough to be actionable. What the confirmation changed was the certainty. Ned had been operating on probability, the probability that the children were James, the probability that the lineage pattern meant what it appeared to mean. Bran's vision added not probability, something else. Something that operated in a different register than evidence, and that Ned, who was a practical man in a mystical family, did not have a framework for processing. He processed it anyway. He did this by setting the framework aside and accepting the data. The data said, Bran sees through trees. The data said, what Bran sees corresponds to reality. The data said, the Queen and the Kingslayer are together in the specific way that produces children. The data, combined with the lineage evidence, produced a conclusion that was not merely probable, but confirmed through 2 independent channels, the physical and the supernatural. Ned sat down. He wrote back, Cat, stay in Winterfell. Keep Bran close. Do not let him tell anyone else what he sees. The information is dangerous, and the danger is proportional to the number of people who know Stannis is coming. When Stannis arrives, we move. Not before. Tell Bran I love him, and that the gift he has is important. More important than he knows. More important than I can explain in a letter. He sealed it. He gave it to Jory, who would ride north again. Then he went to the window. He thought, my son can see through trees, and the kingdom I'm serving is built on a lie. He thought, these 2 things are connected. He didn't know how they were connected. Not yet. But the instinct, the Stark instinct, the pattern recognition that operated below the level of analysis, said they were connected, and the instinct had been right about every important thing Ned had ever trusted it about. He waited for Stannis. Littlefinger, the plan that didn't ignite. 298 AC. Awkward. Peter Baelish had a problem. The problem was, nothing was happening. Not the nothing of a quiet court. Courts were never quiet. Courts produced noise the way rivers produced current, the constant background hum of ambition and grievance, and the specific social friction of powerful people rubbing against each other in confined spaces. The nothing was structural, the specific absence of crisis that Baelish's plan required and that wasn't materializing. The plan had been elegant. Baelish's plans were always elegant. The specific Littlefinger aesthetic of complexity, disguised as simplicity. The Rube Goldberg machinery of political manipulation, built to look like a series of unrelated accidents. The plan. Jon Arryn dies. Arranged. Lysa writes to Catelyn. Arranged. The Starks are afraid. Achieved. The Starks come south. Achieved. Then, the Stark boy falls. The dagger appears. Catelyn comes south. Catelyn trusts Peter. Peter points Catelyn at the Lannisters. Catelyn arrests Tyrion. Tywin attacks the Riverlands. War. Chaos. And in the chaos, in the specific fog of a realm at war, Petyr Baelish, the man nobody noticed, the man everyone underestimated, the man with no armies and no titles and no lands worth naming, Petyr Baelish climbs. The boy hadn't fallen. This was the problem. The specific domino that was supposed to start the cascade. The Stark boy, the tower, the Lannisters' secret discovered, the assassination attempt that would produce the dagger, that would produce the accusation, that would produce the arrest, that would produce the war. The domino hadn't fallen, because the boy hadn't fallen, because the boy hadn't climbed. Baelish sat in his chambers in the Red Keep and considered his options. The options were adjust. Littlefinger was nothing if not adaptable, the specific quality of a man who had been outmatched physically, socially, and economically his entire life, and who had survived the outmatching through the ability to see the board when it changed, and to reposition faster than the other players. The board had changed. The dagger was unused. The catalyst was absent. He could create another catalyst. This was possible. The specific skill set that had produced Jon Arryn's death could produce other deaths, other crises, other dominoes. But the new catalyst would need to be, he thought about this, the calculation running behind the smile that was his resting expression, the smile that the court read as harmless, and that was actually the visible surface of a mind working at full speed. The new catalyst would need to produce the same effect. Stark fury aimed at Lannister targets. He tried. He dropped hints. To Ned, the lineage book, the bastards, the specific trail of information that would lead Ned to the truth about Cersei's children. This was the backup plan, not as elegant as the original, not as clean, but functional. If Ned found the truth and confronted it the way Ned confronted things direct, without subtlety, without the political management that the confrontation required, the confrontation would produce the crisis. Ned would accuse, Cersei would respond, the conflict would escalate, the war would come. But Ned wasn't confronting. Ned was Baelish. Watched this with the specific frustrated fascination of a man watching his machinery fail. Ned was being cautious. Ned was investigating slowly. Ned was building evidence rather than making accusations. Ned was doing the thing that Ned Stark was constitutionally incapable of doing in Baelish's model of the man, which was being political. Why? Baelish didn't know. He didn't know. Because the variable that had changed the variable that existed in the other timeline, and that didn't exist in this one, was invisible to him. The variable was Bran alive, unbroken, not consuming Ned's attention with grief and fear. The 40% of Ned's cognitive capacity that Bran's crisis would have consumed was available. And the availability was producing a Ned Stark who was for the first time in Baelish's experience of the man thinking before acting. Baelish didn't know about Bran's visions. Baelish didn't know about the letters. Baelish didn't know that the investigation was being confirmed through a channel that his intelligence network, comprehensive, expensive, spanning the entire realm, couldn't detect because the channel was supernatural, and Baelish's network was emphatically not. He knew something was wrong. He knew because the timeline was wrong. Ned should have confronted, should have acted, should have produced the crisis by now. The not confronting was itself information, and the information said, something has changed. Someone has gotten to Ned. Someone has provided Ned with counsel that Baelish's plan didn't account for. When Stannis arrived in King's Landing, Baelish understood. Stannis, the one variable that Baelish had calculated as static Stannis on Dragonstone, Stannis withdrawn. Stannis doing the specific Stannis thing of being right and being absent simultaneously. Stannis was not absent. Stannis was in the capital. Stannis was meeting with Ned. Stannis was providing the specific strategic counsel that Ned needed and that Baelish had intended to provide himself through the filter of manipulation that would have directed the counsel toward the crisis. Stannis couldn't be manipulated. This was the specific Stannis quality that made him both useless and dangerous to Baelish's planning. Stannis was impervious to the specific social tools that Baelish wielded: the flattery, the insinuation, the careful deployment of trust as a weapon. Stannis didn't trust anyone. Stannis's distrust was constitutional rather than strategic, built into the architecture of the man, and the architecture was, Baelish could see this, could appreciate it even as it frustrated him impenetrable. Baelish adjusted. Not the plan was dead. The specific cascade that required Stark fury and Lannister response, and the escalating crisis of a realm at war, was not going to materialize, because Ned and Stannis were managing the truth through institutional channels rather than personal confrontation. Baelish adjusted his position, from architect of crisis to observer of transition, from the man who starts the war to the man who survives the peace. The adjustment was not graceful. It was the kind of strategic retreat that looked like strategic positioning if you did it right, and that looks like defeat if you didn't. Baelish did it right. He positioned himself as useful to the transition. He provided financial counsel to the new arrangement, the Crown's debt, the Treasury's restructuring, the specific economic management that the post-Cersei kingdom would require. He made himself indispensable in the way that Baelish made himself indispensable to every arrangement, by being the person who understood the money. And he waited. Because Littlefinger was underneath everything, underneath the plans and the adjustments, and the specific adaptability that had kept him alive in a world of bigger, stronger, more powerful men. Littlefinger was patient. The boy who had been cut open by Bran Stark, and who had been sent away from Riverrun, and who had spent 20 years climbing from nothing to master of coin. That boy was patient. The patience was built on the foundation of rage, and the rage was built on the foundation of love. The specific, deformed, toxic love that Baelish carried for Catelyn Tully, and that had been the engine of everything he'd done for 20 years. The love hadn't gone anywhere. The plan had failed, but the love persisted, because the love was not connected to the plan. The love was connected to the bone. And the bone didn't break when the plans broke. Baelish waited. He adjusted. He climbed. Different route. Same destination. The chaos hadn't come through the door he'd built. He'd find another door. He always did. Jon at the Wall, 298 AC. Jon Snow took the Black the same week his father rode south. The decision was the same in every version of this story. Jon went to the Wall because the Wall was the place that accepted everyone, and because Jon had spent 14 years in a castle where his position was defined by what he wasn't, legitimate rather than what he was, everything else. The Wall offered the specific egalitarian promise of an institution that didn't care about your name. You were a brother of the Watch. Period. The reality of the Watch was not what the promise described. The Watch was understaffed, underfunded, manned by criminals and cast-offs. The specific institutional decay that happened when a society stopped funding its defensive infrastructure because the threat the infrastructure defended against was too old and too distant to feel real. Jon adapted. He adapted the way Jon adapted to everything, by being competent, by being better than the situation required, by training harder and working harder and performing the specific relentless excellence that was Jon's response to every environment that questioned his worth. He made friends. Sam Tarly, the fat boy from the Reach, who had been sent to the Wall by a father who considered him an embarrassment, and who was, beneath the fat and the fear, the kindest and most perceptive person Jon had met. Gren, Pip, the specific fraternity of young men at the Wall who were becoming brothers in the Watch's sense, and who were, for Jon, the first peer group he'd ever had that didn't carry the asterisk of bastardy. He rose through the ranks. Not quickly, the Watch didn't do quickly. But the Lord Commander, Jor Mormont, noticed him the way experienced commanders noticed. Talented recruits, with the specific evaluative attention of a man who had been identifying useful people for 40 years, and who recognized, in Jon Snow, the raw material for something the Watch needed. The ranging started in Jon's second month, beyond the Wall, into the territories that the Watch was supposed to patrol, and that the Watch patrolled with decreasing frequency and increasing casualties. Jon went on his first ranging and came back with the specific information that would have, in another timeline, arrived through violence and death and a catastrophic encounter with the dead at the Fist of the First Men. In this timeline, the information arrived through a ranging that was not safe. No ranging was safe, but structured, planned, conducted by a Watch that was, thanks to the intelligence that Bran's visions had begun to produce, cancitted through Maester Aemon, who received the Weirwood communications with the specific Targaryen sensitivity that his blood provided. A Watch that was prepared for what the ranging would find. Jon saw the dead. A patrol. Small. 15, 20. The specific advance elements that the Night King's army sent south as scouts. The dead moved through the haunted forest with the organized purposelessness of things that were not alive, and that were directed by something that was not present. The ranging party had dragonglass. Not much. 6 pieces, sent from Dragonstone on Ned's orders. The first shipment of what would eventually become a flood. But enough. Enough to prove that the dragonglass worked, that the dead could be killed, permanently, by the obsidian. Jon killed 2 of the dead. He killed them with dragonglass and the specific concentrated fury of a man who had found in the dead an enemy that was not ambiguous. The dead were not political. The dead were not complicated. The dead were a threat, pure and simple, and the simplicity of the threat produced in Jon a clarity that the complicated social dynamics of his life had never provided. He came back to Castle Black. He wrote to his father. The dead are real. The dragonglass works. Send more. Send everything. The letter arrived in King's Landing at the same time that Catelyn's letter about Bran arrived. The convergence was, Ned sat at his desk with 2 letters, one from his son at the Wall and one from his wife at Winterfell, both saying the same thing. The threat is real. The threat is immediate. The response needs to be everything. 2 children, 2 sources, 2 confirmations of the same truth. Ned went to Stannis. The preparation began. Robert, The Grief, 288 AC. Robert Baratheon drank for a week after the trial. Not the Robert drinking that was his daily habit, the recreational consumption that had been his primary pastime since the end of the rebellion, and that had converted the warrior's body into the king's body over 15 years. This was different. This was the specific, determined consumption of a man trying to fill a hole that drink couldn't fill, and who was going to keep trying until the trying killed him or the hole closed. And the odds were on the trying. Ned found him in his chambers on the 5th night. The chambers were... Ned looked at the room with the assessment of a man who had been managing crises for months and who was now encountering a crisis he couldn't manage through evidence or process. The room was a disaster. Bottles, empty, half empty, broken. Plates of food untouched, the curtains drawn against the light. The specific physical environment of a man who had decided that the world outside the room was too painful, and who had created inside the room a space where the pain could be experienced without witnesses. Robert was in a chair. Not the throne. A regular chair. A chair that was too small for him, and that he'd sunk into with the specific gravity of a man whose body was too heavy for whatever was holding it up. Go away. No. I said go away, Ned. I heard you. No. Ned sat across from him. Not in a chair. On the floor. Because the chairs were full of Robert's grief in the form of empty bottles and discarded clothing, and the specific detritus of a week of self-destruction, and because sitting on the floor brought Ned to Robert's level, and the being at level was the thing. I brought you water. I don't want water. I know. Drink it anyway. Robert looked at the cup, looked at Ned. The eyes were... Robert's eyes had always been blue. Robert's eyes were now the specific red-blue of a man who had been crying and drinking in alternating sequence, and whose eyes had lost the ability to distinguish between the two. They were never mine. I know. I held them. When they were born. I held Joffrey, and I thought he was mine. I was drunk when he was born. I was drunk and I held him, and I thought, this is my son. Robert, he's not my son. None of them are my sons. My wife was fucking her brother for 17 years. And I didn't... How did I not see it, Ned? I'm not stupid. You're not stupid. You trusted. Trust is not stupidity. Trust is exactly stupidity when the person you're trusting is... Robert picked up a bottle. Found it empty. Set it down. I loved her. No, I didn't love her. I tried to love her. I tried, and I failed because she wasn't... He stopped. She wasn't Lyanna. The name landed in the room. Ned absorbed it. The way he absorbed everything about Lyanna, with the specific, controlled grief of a man who had lost his sister, and who carried the loss the way he carried everything. Internally. Structurally. Without display. Nobody is Lyanna. I know. But I looked for her. In every woman. In Cersei. I looked for the thing that Lyanna was. The fire. The life in her. And it wasn't there. It was never there. And instead of seeing what was there, what Cersei actually was, I drank, and I whored, and I... Robert's voice was doing the thing that large men's voices did, when the thing inside was large enough to match the body. I made it easy for her. The distance. The absence. I was absent for 17 years, and the absence was the space where Jaime... Robert, none of this is your fault. Some of it is my fault. The drinking, the absences, I wasn't a husband. I was barely a king. Jon Arryn was the king. I was the man who sat in the chair, and who signed what Jon told him to sign, and who went hunting when the signing was done. He looked at Ned. You should have been hand from the start. I was in the north. You were in the north because you chose the north over me. And you were right to choose. You saw what I was becoming, and you went north instead of watching. Robert leaned forward. Don't go north again. Robert, I need you here. The realm, the trial, the succession, Stannis, the whole mess. I need you here. Ned looked at his friend. At the man who had been a warrior and a lover and a king, and who was now a drunk in a dark room, discovering that the family he'd believed in was a fiction, and that the fiction's collapse had left him with nothing except the throne, and the throne's demands, and a best friend who had discovered the truth, and who had presented it institutionally rather than personally because the institutional was safer. I'm here, Ned said. I'm not going anywhere. The North. There are other things happening in the North. Things I need to tell you about. What things? The Wall. The Watch. Ned paused. How do you tell a grieving king that his personal crisis is about to be superseded by an existential one? How do you tell a man who has just lost his children that the world is about to lose everything? There's a threat from beyond the Wall, a real one, the kind that the Wall was built for. Robert looked at him. What kind of threat? The kind that makes the succession crisis look small. Robert stared at Ned. The grief was still there. The grief wasn't going anywhere. The grief was going to be Robert's companion for the rest of his life. But something else was emerging from underneath the grief. Something that hadn't been active in 15 years. Something that the drinking and the whoring and the absence had buried, but hadn't killed. The warrior. Tell me, Ned told him. Robert listened. And for the first time in 15 years, the listening produced not the glazed inattention of a man who didn't care about governance, but the specific, focused intensity of a man who had been a commander before he was a king, and was hearing something that activated the part of him that the kingship had suppressed. An army of the dead, coming south, in years, not decades. And you know this because my son can see through trees, and my other son has fought the dead at the Wall, and both of them are telling me the same thing. Robert looked at the bottles, at the room, at the wreckage of the week. He stood up. Not steadily. The week of drinking had done what weeks of drinking did. But he stood. The specific Robert gesture of standing up when the thing in front of him required standing rather than sitting. The warrior's instinct overriding the drunk's inertia. Get me a bath, an armor, and... He looked at Ned. And whatever your son says we need. Dragon glass, men, whatever. Robert, I've been sitting in a chair for 15 years, drinking, mourning a woman who's been dead for 15 years, married to a woman who was fucking her brother. His voice was rough, but his eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in years. I'm done sitting. Give me something to fight. Ned looked at his friend. He thought, the warrior. Still there. Under everything. He thought, if Robert Baratheon channels his grief into the preparation for the long night instead of into the bottle, the preparation might actually work. He thought, this is the first good thing that's happened since I came south. Bath first, Ned said. Bath first, Robert agreed. The king bathed. The king dressed. The king went to the small council and sat in the chair and told the council, we're going to war. Not the war they expected. Not Lannisters. Not Tyrells. Not the dynastic conflicts that the realm had been processing for months. A different war. The war the Wall was built for. The war that a 7-year-old boy in a Godswood and a 14-year-old boy at the Wall had been trying to tell them about. The real war. Stannis arrives. 298 AC. Stannis Baratheon arrived at King's Landing like a military operation arriving at a theatre of engagement, on time, with resources, carrying the specific Stannis energy of a man who did not waste motion or words, and who found both wasting to be symptoms of a character deficit that he was constitutionally incapable of overlooking. He came with 50 men, not an army, a retinue, the specific calibrated force that said, I am here as a political actor, not a military one, but I have enough steel behind me to make the distinction academic if the distinction is tested. He met Ned in the Tower of the Hand. The meeting was, Ned had met Stannis before, at Robert's court, at the occasional council session that Stannis attended with the grim efficiency of a man fulfilling a duty he found distasteful. Stannis was not charismatic. Stannis was not warm. Stannis was a man whose virtues, honesty, discipline, strategic intelligence, were the kind of virtues that were admired in theory and avoided in person, because the person displaying them made the avoidance seem like cowardice. You've confirmed it. Not a question. Stannis sat across from Ned in the solar with the posture of a man who had never in his life found a comfortable position in a chair, and who had decided, decades ago, that comfort was for people with weaker backbones. 3 of Robert's bastards, all with the Baratheon colouring. None of the Queen's children have it. The lineage book shows every Baratheon for 300 years the same colouring, without exception. I know the evidence. I assembled most of it with Jon Arryn before Jon died. Why didn't you present it? Stannis's jaw. The specific Stannis jaw clench that was the nearest he came to visible emotion. Because Jon Arryn was going to present it. Jon Arryn was building the case, not the suspicion. The case that could be presented to Robert with the weight of proof rather than accusation. Jon died before the case was complete. Died or was killed. Was killed. Obviously, the timing, the specific timing, the case nearly complete, the presentation imminent, the timing is evidence of its own. Someone knew what Jon was doing and eliminated him before the doing produced the result. Who? Stannis's face. The mask of a man who had opinions about everything and who expressed the opinions with the specific Stannis clarity that made the expressing feel like being hit with a dictionary. The Queen. The Lannisters. The specific structure that benefits from the secret remaining a secret. He looked at Ned. Your man Baelish. He told you about the book. He pointed me in the right direction. Baelish points everyone in the right direction. The question is why? Stannis leaned forward. Baelish is not your ally. Baelish is a man who provides useful information to everyone and who benefits from the conflict that the useful information produces. He pointed you at the lineages, because a Stark with the lineages creates a crisis, and a crisis is an opportunity, and Baelish lives on opportunities. Ned absorbed this. In another timeline, Ned would not have absorbed this because Catelyn's trust in Baelish would have overridden Ned's instinct, and the overriding would have produced the specific misplaced trust that led to the disaster. In this timeline, Catelyn was in Winterfell. Catelyn's trust was not a factor. And Stannis, who was many things that Ned found abrasive, but who was also the most relentlessly honest political analyst available, Stannis's assessment of Baelish was landing on ground that was not preceded with Catelyn's childhood loyalty. What do? We tell Robert. Robert will lose his mind. Robert will want Cersei dead, and Jaime dead, and the children Stannis stopped. The stop was not emotion, it was calculation. The specific Stannis process of projecting consequences before speaking. Robert will want blood. The question is whether we can contain the bloodletting, or whether the bloodletting becomes the war. How do we contain it? We don't tell Robert alone. We tell Robert in front of the council, in front of witnesses. The presence of witnesses creates a political framework. The revelation becomes an institutional event rather than a personal one, and institutional events are managed through process rather than emotion. You want to present the case to the full small council. I want to present the case to the full small council, with the evidence documented, with Robert present, with the specific procedural weight that prevents the response from being Robert takes a warhammer to Jaime Lannister's skull in the throne room. Ned looked at Stannis. He thought, this is better. This is different from what I would have done. What I would have done would do, left to my own devices, is go to Robert alone, tell him the truth, and trust Robert to handle it. And Robert would not handle it. Robert would rage. Robert would kill. Robert would produce the specific catastrophic response that Robert produced when his emotions were engaged and his judgment was not. Stannis was right. The containment mattered. The process mattered. When? Tomorrow. The small council meets at midday. We present. Together. Together. I am Robert's legitimate heir, if the children are Jaime's. My presence at the presentation communicates. The succession is secured. The Baratheon line is not ended. The transition is orderly. Ned nodded. Stannis stood. One more thing. What? The Lannisters will respond. Not immediately. Cersei is emotional. She'll react before she plans. But Tywin will respond. And Tywin's response will be measured, calculated. Tywin has been building the Lannister position for 40 years, and the position is not going to be surrendered because a lineage book says his grandchildren are bastards. Stannis held Ned's gaze. The presentation is the beginning, Lord Stark, not the end. Ned knew this. He knew it in the way he knew military things, the specific understanding that the first engagement was not the war, and that the war was won or lost in the engagements that followed the first one. I'll be ready. Will you? I'll be ready. Stannis left. Ned sat in the solar. He thought, tomorrow. He thought, everything changes tomorrow. He was right, but not in the way he expected. The small council, the truth. 2:28 AC. The small council chamber was full in the way that rooms went full when the occupants understood that something historic was about to happen, and that their presence at the happening would define their position in whatever came after. The council members were present. Pycelle, Varys, Baelish, Renly, Robert's younger brother, who had come to the capital from Storm's End at Stannis' quiet insistence, which was itself a political statement that nobody had decoded yet. The king was present. Robert, sitting at the head of the table with a cup, and the expression of a man who had been told that the midday council was important, and who had attended because Ned asked, and because Robert still did things that Ned asked, which was the residue of a friendship that had survived 15 years of distance, and that was about to be tested past the point of survival. Ned and Stannis entered together. This was noted. The Hand and the King's brother, two men who had no reason to arrive together, whose relationship was based on mutual obligation rather than mutual warmth, entering the council chamber in coordination. The noting produced the specific atmospheric change that happened in rooms when the occupants sensed a shift and began preparing for the consequences. Ned carried the book, the lineages and histories, the heavy volume that Jon Arryn had been reading when he died. The book was a physical thing, leather-bound, thick, the specific weight of 300 years of genealogical records. The carrying was a statement. He set it on the table. Robert looked at the book, looked at Ned, looked at Stannis. What's this? Ned began. He began the way he began everything, directly, without preamble, with the specific Stark approach to truth-telling that prioritized the truth over the telling. Your Grace. The book in front of you is the lineages and histories of the great houses. It records the physical characteristics of every noble family in the Seven Kingdoms for 300 years. Jon Arryn was reading this book when he died. He was reading it because the book reveals a pattern in the Baratheon bloodline that is inconsistent with the current succession. Robert's face. Not understanding yet the specific pre-comprehension state of a man who was receiving information that was going to change everything, and whose mind was still in the old everything, still processing the words without the implications. The Baratheon bloodline produces the same physical characteristics in every generation. Black hair, blue eyes, in every documented Baratheon for 3 centuries. In every confirmed Baratheon child, including your natural children, whom I have visited and confirmed. Robert's face was changing. The comprehension arriving, not all at once in stages. The way dawn arrived. The light increasing gradually, and the darkness receding, and the things that had been invisible in the dark becoming visible. Your children Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen have none of these characteristics. They have blonde hair and green eyes. Lannister coloring. The room. Robert's cup was on the table. His hand was around it. The hand was tightening. The specific physical response of a man whose body was processing something before his mind was ready, and whose body's response was grip. Hold, compress. What are you saying, Ned? I'm saying what Jon Arryn was going to say before he died. I'm saying what Stannis has known for months, and what the evidence in this book and in the persons of your natural children confirms beyond reasonable dispute. Ned held Robert's gaze. Your children are not your children. They are Jaime Lannisters. The room broke, not loudly, the specific silent fracture of a space where every person was processing the same information simultaneously, and where the processing produced not noise, but the absence of noise. The vacuum that happened when breath was held and bodies went still, and the specific electrical charge of a catastrophic revelation filled the air. Robert's face. Ned watched it happen. Watched the comprehension arrive fully. Watched the denial brief, instinctive, the mind's reflexive rejection of information that threatened the foundation. Watched the denial fail, crumple, collapse, under the weight of the evidence that Ned had presented, and that Robert's own observation, now freed from the denial's management, was confirming. Robert knew. Not because Ned had told him, because Robert had known. In the way that people knew things they didn't want to know, the information present in the subconscious, available if the conscious mind allowed it, suppressed because. The allowing would destroy the architecture of the life. The children didn't look like him. Robert had seen this, had not seen this, had looked at blonde children, and thought they'd take after their mother, because the alternative to thinking that was unthinkable. The unthinkable had been thought. Robert stood. Out, the word was a force. Not loud, louder than loud. The specific Robert register that was beyond volume, that was the sound a man made when the thing inside him was too large for the man, and the man was trying to contain it through the only tool available, which was command. All of you. Out. Not you, he pointed at Ned. Not you, at Stannis. The rest of you. Out. They left, Pycelle first, with the scuttling speed of a man who had been in the room when power changed hands, and who had developed the survival instinct to leave before the changing was complete. Varys second, with the smooth departure that was Varys' signature present and then not, the specific social disappearance of a man who had been vanishing from dangerous rooms for 30 years. Baelish third, with the specific reluctant departure of a man who wanted to stay because the information was currency, and the currency was enormous, and leaving meant missing the denomination. Renly stayed. Robert hadn't told him to leave. Robert looked at Ned. Jaime, yes, and Cersei. Yes, Robert's hand was still around the cup. The cup was Ned heard it crack, the ceramic giving way under a grip that was applying the force that should have been applied to a warhammer, and that was, in the absence of a warhammer, destroying the nearest available object. The cup broke. Wine and ceramic on the table. Robert looked at the wreckage, looked at his hand, looked at the blood where a shard had cut his palm. I'm going to kill him. Robert, I'm going to kill Jaime Lannister. I'm going to Robert. Stannis' voice. The specific Stannis intervention cold, precise. The verbal equivalent of a bucket of water on a fire that was about to become uncontrollable. The response to this needs to be institutional, not personal. If you kill Jaime Lannister in the throne room, you produce a war. If you process this through the legal structure arrest, trial, verdict, you produce a transition. The distinction is the distinction between a kingdom that survives and a kingdom that... Robert looked at his brother. A trial. An arrest. A trial. A verdict. The children's status, addressed through council decision, not through violence. Cersei, addressed through the faith, through annulment, through the legal mechanisms that exist for exactly this situation. I don't want mechanisms. I want... What you want and what the kingdom needs are not the same thing. They rarely are. That's what being king means. Stannis held the gaze. You're my brother. I am telling you. The response needs to be managed. Not for Cersei's sake. Not for Jaime's. For the realm's. Robert looked at the broken cup. He looked at the wine on the table. He looked at Ned. You knew. I found out. Weeks ago. I've been preparing this. Preparing. So the response could be what Stannis said. Managed. Institutional. You've been in my city for weeks, knowing that my wife was fucking her brother and you. Prepared. I was doing what Jon Arryn was doing when Jon Arryn was murdered. I was building the case so the case could be presented properly. Robert sat down. He sat the way men sat when the standing was no longer possible. Heavily, completely. The body surrendering to gravity, because the willpower that had been keeping it upright was now being used for something else. My children. They're not. I held them. When they were born, I held Joffrey. Robert's voice was doing something that Ned had never heard it do. Breaking. The specific fracture of a large man's voice when the thing inside was not anger but grief, and the grief was the first time, and the first time was always the worst. I held that boy, and I thought, I know. You don't know. You have 5 children who are yours. You know exactly who they are because they came from you and Kat. And the knowing is, it's the foundation. You don't think about it because you don't have to. It's there. Robert's eyes were red. My foundation just disappeared. Ned leaned forward. Robert, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about how this happened. And I'm sorry about the timing, and I'm sorry about everything. But Stannis is right. The response matters. How we handle this determines whether the kingdom survives the handling. Robert looked at Ned. He looked at his brother. He looked at the wreckage on the table. All right. His voice was not calm, controlled. The specific Robert control that was the opposite of his natural state, and that was applied to situations where the natural state would produce a catastrophe. Arrest them, both of them, tonight, before they hear about this meeting and run. I'll handle it, Stannis said, not alone. Ned too, both of you, with men. Enough men that the Kingsguard doesn't interfere. Stannis and Ned left. Robert sat in the council chamber alone. He looked at the broken cup, at the wine, at the blood on his hand. He thought about Cersei. He thought about Joffrey. He thought about 17 years of a marriage that had been a performance, and 3 children that had been a lie, and the specific experience of a man discovering that the thing he'd built his family on was nothing. Fraud. The specific emptiness that happened when you pulled the foundation out and discovered there was nothing underneath. He drank. Not from the broken cup. He called for a bottle. The bottle came. He drank. The drinking was the Robert response. The drinking was what Robert did when the thing inside him was too large. And the alternatives to drinking were either violence or grief. And the violence was being managed by Stannis. And the grief was new. And Robert didn't know what to do with new things. He drank until the bottle was empty. Then he called for another. Sansa. What the court taught her. 298 AC. Sansa Stark was 11 years old, and she was learning the most important lesson King's Landing would ever teach her. The difference between what things looked like and what things were. She had come south with romantic ideas. The court was supposed to be beautiful. The knights, the ladies, the tournaments, the specific fairy tale architecture of a world where courtesy and honor produced beauty, and beauty was the highest achievement. The court was beautiful. The court was also a mechanism for the production and distribution of power, and the mechanism ran on fear and ambition and the specific human willingness to perform emotions rather than feel them. And the performing was Sansa saw this. Over weeks and months, with the specific growing awareness of a girl whose romantic education was being replaced by a political one, the performing was everything. The court was a stage. Everyone was acting. The kindness was performance. The courtesy was performance. The beauty was performance. Joffrey was performance. This was the lesson that hit hardest. Joffrey Baratheon, the Crown Prince, blonde, handsome in the specific polished way that Lannister wealth and Lannister breeding produced, had been, in Sansa's initial assessment, the prince from the songs. He was not the prince from the songs. He was a boy whose cruelty was intermittent enough to be mistaken for normalcy, and whose kindness was performed with the specific mechanical quality of someone who had learned the motions of kindness without understanding the emotion. Sansa noticed. She noticed because Sansa's gift, the gift she didn't know she had. The gift that Winterfell hadn't needed because Winterfell didn't require its residents to read the difference between genuine and performed, was social perception. The specific ability to stand in a room and read the emotional subtext the way her father read military terrain, systematically, comprehensively, with the attention to detail that produced accurate assessments. She noticed that Joffrey's kindness was always public, and always witnessed, and always directed at people who could report on it. She noticed that Joffrey's cruelty was always private, and always directed at people who couldn't report on it. She noticed the specific pattern that these two observations produced, which was a boy who understood the currency of reputation, and who was spending it with the specific calculated efficiency of someone who had been taught that reputation was a tool. She filed this. She filed it the way she filed everything in the social catalogue that she was building. The specific map of King's Landing's human terrain that Sansa was constructing, without knowing she was constructing it, and that would, eventually, be the most valuable intelligence asset in the Red Keep. Because Sansa's map included information that Varys' network didn't capture, which was how people felt. Not what they did, how they felt. The emotional truth underneath the behavioral performance. When the arrest came, when Joffrey was told that he was not Robert's son, when the foundation of Joffrey's world collapsed, Sansa saw the real boy for the first time. The real Joffrey was afraid. Not cruel. Not sadistic. Not the monster that the court would later remember. Afraid. A 12-year-old who had been told that his father wasn't his father, and that his identity was based on a lie, and who was responding to the information with the specific raw terror of a child whose world had been dismantled. Sansa saw this because Sansa was in the corridor when Joffrey was told. Not deliberately, accidentally. The specific geometry of a girl walking from her chambers to the kitchens intersecting with the specific moment when Ned Stark told Joffrey Baratheon the truth. She saw his face. She saw the fear underneath the face. She thought, he's just a boy. She thought, a terrible boy who was going to be a terrible king, but also just a boy whose mother lied to him and whose world is gone. She didn't feel sorry for him. Sympathy was a luxury that the political education was stripping from her. But she understood him. For the first time. The understanding was the beginning of something, the specific Sansa quality of understanding people who were not sympathetic and not kind and not good. Of seeing the human underneath the performance. Of mapping the emotional terrain of even the people she found repellent. This quality would serve her for the rest of her life. This quality, the ability to understand without sympathizing, to see without being blinded by what she saw, to catalogue the human condition without being consumed by it, this was the gift the court gave her. It was not the gift she'd come south looking for. It was the gift she needed. Arya, what the court taught her, 298 AC. Arya. Stark was 9 years old, and she hated King's Landing with the concentrated passion of a child who had been told to sit still, and who was constitutionally incapable of sitting still, and who found the instruction personally offensive. The Scepter wanted her to sew. Arya did not want to sew. The dancing master wanted her to dance. Arya wanted to fight. The court wanted her to be a lady. Arya wanted to be... Arya didn't know what she wanted to be. She knew what she didn't want to be, which was everything they were telling her to be. Ned hired Syrio Forel, the first sword of Bravos, a water dancer. The specific Bravosi approach to combat that was built on speed and precision rather than strength. And that was, Ned had made this decision with the specific fatherly awareness that the child in front of him wasn't going to be managed into compliance, and that the energy needed a channel, or the energy would find its own channels, and the own channels would be destructive. The approach that suited Arya, the way northern swordsmanship suited Robb. Naturally, constitutionally, in the body. Arya trained. She trained with Syrio every morning, and the training was the only time in King's Landing that Arya felt like herself. The yard was hers. The sword was hers. The specific physical vocabulary of a girl who was small and fast, and who discovered, in the water dance, a language that her body spoke fluently, and that didn't require her to be anything she wasn't. The arrest of the Queen didn't concern Arya. Not because Arya was callous, because Arya was 9 and the political implications of the Queen's arrest were abstract in a way that Arya's 9-year-old mind couldn't process. What Arya processed was, something had changed, and the adults were frightened, and the fear in the adults produced a specific atmospheric tension in the castle that made Arya's already heightened energy spike into something approaching feral. She trained harder. The training was the response, the specific Arya mechanism for managing environments she couldn't control. It was control the body, control what you can, the sword, the footwork, the specific physical mastery that was the one domain where Arya Stark wasn't being told she was wrong. Syrio noticed. The girl is fighting harder. The girl is scared. Of what? Of everything. Of the court and the arrest and the things the adults are saying and the way the castle feels. Arya held the practice sword. The thin blade. The needle of the south. I don't understand any of it. I just know it's bad. Bad is not forever. Bad is a season. You are training for the season after bad. What's the season after bad? The season when the trained people are the ones who survive. Syrio looked at her with the dark Bravosi eyes that had been assessing fighters for 30 years, and that found, in this 9-year-old northern girl, something worth the assessing. Not today. Not today. Say it again. Not today. Good. Now, the left foot. Again. Arya trained. The court taught Sansa to see. The court taught Arya to fight. The court taught both of them the lesson that the court taught every Stark who came south. The south is not the north. The rules are different here, and the children who survive the south are the children who learn the rules fast enough to play the game rather than be played by it. They learned. Differently. In different registers. With different tools. But they learned. The arrest. What the truth cost. 298 AC. They came for Cersei at midnight. Not with drama. Ned had been specific about this. The arrest was institutional, not theatrical. 50 men. Stark guards and Baratheon guards. The specific combined force that communicated. This is the crown acting, not a faction. The combination mattered because the combination prevented the arrest from being interpreted as a northern coup or a Baratheon internal dispute. This was the law. The law was being applied. Jaime was in the White Sword Tower. The arrest of a Kingsguard by other Kingsguard was Ned watched this from the corridor, because watching was all he could do. The actual arrest being conducted by Sir Barristan Selmy, who was Lord Commander and who had the authority to arrest a brother of the Order, and who conducted the arrest with the specific grim efficiency of a man who had served 5 kings and who had survived the serving by, understanding that the oath was to the institution and not to the person. Wearing the white. Jaime was in his chambers. He was not armed, not fully. The sword belt was off. The armor was racked. He was reading. The specific incongruity of the most notorious knight in the realm being arrested while reading a book was something that the songs would later skip, because it didn't fit the narrative of a man who was supposed to be either fighting or plotting. Barristan said, "Sir Jaime, you're to come with me." Jaime looked up. His face Ned watched from the doorway did the thing that Jaime's face did, which was nothing. The nothing was a performance, and the performance was Jaime's primary defense mechanism, and the defense was engaged with the speed that came from a lifetime of maintaining it. On whose authority? The King's. Lord Stark's. Lord Stannis's. Jaime set down the book. Stood, looked at the guards, the 50 men, the combined Stark Baratheon force. All of this. For me. For the charges. Which charges? There are so many available. Kingslaying? That's old news. Something newer? Incest. Treason. The fathering of bastards presented to the realm as the king's legitimate heirs. Jaime's face. The nothing cracked not dramatically, not the kind of crack that produced a visible reaction for the watching guards. The kind of crack that was visible only to someone who was looking for it, and who knew what Jaime looked like when the performance failed. Ned was looking. Ned saw the crack. "Ah," Jaime said. That, he went with them. Without resistance, without the specific dramatic last stand that the songs would have preferred. No drawn sword, no defiant speech, no burning of the white cloak in the courtyard. Jaime Lannister walked through the corridors of the Red Keep, with Barristan Selmy on one side and 3 guards on the other, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this, who had, in some deep private place, been expecting this for 17 years, and who found, now that the expecting was over, that the arrival of the thing was almost a relief. Almost. Cersei was louder. Cersei was arrested in the Queen's chambers by Stannis personally, which was Ned learned this afterward, from Stannis's account, which was delivered with the specific Stannis style of reporting, factual, sequential, with no emotional commentary, which was a decision Stannis had made deliberately, because Stannis believed that the arrest of a queen required the authority of a prince, and that the authority of a prince was the only authority that could not be challenged by the Queen's defenders. Cersei screamed. Not in fear, in rage, the specific Cersei rage that was the core of her being, and that emerged when the threats that Cersei had been managing through performance and manipulation, and the specific Cersei arsenal of beauty and motherhood and political leverage were no longer sufficient. When the management failed, the rage was what remained, and the rage was enormous and undirected and destructive. You can't, I can. The king commands it. The King Robert doesn't have the he can't. The king is the law. The king's authority is absolute in matters of treason. You are accused of treason specifically, of adultery with your brother, and of presenting the resulting children as the king's legitimate heirs, thereby committing fraud against the crown and the succession. Those are my children, those are Jaime Lannister's children. The evidence is comprehensive, and the king has been presented with it, and the king has ordered the arrest. Stannis held her gaze. You may have counsel. You may have a trial. You will not have freedom. Cersei was taken. The children were this was the part that Ned had insisted on, and that Stannis had agreed to, and that Robert had agreed to, grudgingly, through the specific filter of rage and grief that was Robert's response to the revelation. The children were not arrested. Tommen was 8. Myrcella was 9. Joffrey was 12. They were moved to separate chambers. They were not in prison. They were not mistreated. They were told by Ned, because Ned had demanded the responsibility, and because the responsibility was the kind that Ned would not delegate, that their mother had been accused of something serious, and that the accusation would be addressed through the law, and that they were safe. Tommen cried. Myrcella did not cry. Myrcella went still. The specific stillness of a 9-year-old who was smarter than most of the adults around her, and who was processing the situation with the rapid, comprehensive intelligence that was. Ned noted this, filed it, let the implication sit without acting on it. Cersei's intelligence without Cersei's emotional volatility. Myrcella processed, and then she asked, "Is it true?" Ned looked at her. About who our father is. Myrcella. I'm not stupid. I've heard the rumors, the ones the servants whisper, the ones that Joff pretends not to hear, and that I've been hearing for 2 years. She held Ned's gaze with the green Lannister eyes, the eyes that were, in the current context, evidence. Is it true? The trial will determine. Lord Stark, I'm 9. I'm not an idiot. Is it true? Ned looked at this child. He thought about his own children, about Robb and Sansa and Arya and Bran and Rickon, whose parentage was not a question, whose identity was not under siege, whose world was not being dismantled around them by adults who had built the world on a lie. Yes, he said, we believe so. Myrcella nodded. The nod was composure, the 9-year-old version of composure, the specific self-management of a child who had been raised in a court where self-management was survival, and who was deploying the skill in the worst possible context. Thank you for telling me the truth. Ned left the room. In the corridor, he leaned against the wall. He thought, I just told a 9-year-old girl that her father is not her father, and her mother is an adulteress, and her entire identity is based on a lie. He thought, the truth is necessary. He thought, the truth is also cruel. He thought, those are not contradictions. The fallout. The first week. 298 AC. The realm responded. Not with the unified reaction that simple narratives produced. The realm responded the way. The realm responded to everything, which was differently, regionally, based on the specific interests and loyalties and grudges that each house carried, and that each house applied to the new information through the filter of, what does this mean for me? The Westerlands went silent. Tywin Lannister, at Casterly Rock, received the news by Raven. The Raven was followed by a letter from Stannis that was simultaneously an announcement and a challenge. The arrest, the charges, the evidence. The letter was Stannis at his most Stannis factual, complete, leaving no room for the kind of interpretive flexibility that a politician would have used and that Stannis found morally offensive. Tywin's response was silence. For 3 days, no Raven left Casterly Rock, no rider, no communication. The silence was itself a message Tywin was calculating. Tywin was doing the thing that Tywin did with Crisis, which was assess the landscape, identify the optimal response, execute the response with the specific Lannister efficiency that had built the most powerful house in the realm over 40 years. The optimal response was not war. This was the critical calculation, the calculation that Ned and Stannis had been hoping for, and that they had structured the arrest to produce. War required an offense, a grievance, a legitimate basis for military action. The arrest provided none of these. The arrest was legal, conducted under the king's authority, with evidence that was public and that the court had been presented with. A military response to a legal arrest was not rebellion, it was aggression, and aggression against a legitimate king who was acting within his authority would alienate the other great houses rather than rallying them. Tywin knew this. Tywin's letter, when it came, was Ned read it in the solar with Stannis beside him, the most dangerous kind of letter, cooperative. Tywin offered assistance. Tywin offered to travel to King's Landing for the trial. Tywin offered the Lannister treasuries continued support of the crown's finances. He's going to try to buy the outcome, Stannis said. Or manage it. Same thing in Tywin's vocabulary. Ned looked at the letter, at the specific polished cooperativeness of a man who had just been told that his daughter was arrested for incest and treason, and whose response was an offer of financial assistance, which was either the most sophisticated political maneuvering Ned had ever seen, or the most terrifying demonstration of emotional control he had ever witnessed. And the truth was probably both. Let him come, Ned said. A Tywin in King's Landing is a Tywin we can watch. A Tywin at the Rock is a Tywin who's building an army. Stannis considered this acceptable, with conditions. His retinue is limited. 200 men. No Lannister swords beyond the personal guard. He'll push back. He'll push and we'll hold. The position is ours. The law is ours. The king damaged, drinking, furious is ours. Tywin's position is, his daughter is arrested, his son is arrested, his grandchildren are delegitimized. His position is weak. Let him push from weak. The other kingdoms responded differently. The North supported the arrest. Obviously Ned was Northern, and the North supported Ned the way tides supported the moon, automatically, gravitationally. The Reach was cautious. The Tyrells Olenna in particular were processing the information through the specific Tyrell lens of how does this affect our position, and the answer was enormously. The Tyrell marriage plan Marguerite to Joffrey was destroyed. Joffrey was not the heir. Joffrey was a bastard. The Tyrell investment in the Lannister-Baratheon alliance was not worthless, but devalued. And the devaluation required a new strategy. The Riverlands were cautiously supportive Catelyn's family, the Tullys, backing the Stark position, because family was family. Dorne was delighted. Not publicly, Doran Martell did not do public delight. But the specific Dornish satisfaction of watching the Lannisters fall was communicated through channels that Ned's network in King's Landing picked up, and that Ned filed under useful but concerning. Because a kingdom that is delighted by another kingdom's destruction is a kingdom that has its own agenda. The Iron Islands were quiet. Balon Greyjoy was quiet in the way that Balon Greyjoy was always quiet, the quiet of a man on an island who was watching the mainland burn, and who was calculating whether the burning produced an opportunity. The Vale was complicated. Lysa Arryn, Jon Arryn's widow, was in the Eyrie with her son, and with Littlefinger, who had somehow migrated from King's Landing to the Vale in the weeks before the crisis, and who was now positioned as Lysa's advisor, which was itself a piece of information that Ned filed, and that he didn't yet understand the significance of. The realm was not at war. This was the significant thing. The divergence. In another version of this story, the realm was at war by now. Catelyn had arrested Tyrion. Tywin had invaded the Riverlands. Ned had been arrested. The specific cascade of escalating crises that started with Bran's fall had produced a civil war that killed tens of thousands and that destroyed the Stark family. In this version, a legal crisis, not a military one. The arrests were legal. The process was legal. The response was legal. The specific institutional management of a constitutional catastrophe through the legal mechanisms that existed for exactly this kind of catastrophe. Ned had done the thing he was worst at, being political, and it had worked. Not perfectly. The crisis was not resolved. The trial had not happened. Tywin was coming, the Tyrells were recalculating, and the specific long-term consequences of delegitimizing 3 Baratheon children were still unfolding. But the crisis was managed. The realm was not burning. Not burning was an achievement. Bran, the Deeper Sight, 298 AC. In Winterfell, Bran's visions were getting stronger. Not wider, deeper. The initial visions had been surface level. Images, locations, the specific photographic quality of greensight in its early stages, showing Bran what was happening without explaining what the happening meant. The deeper visions were different. The deeper visions carried context, history, the specific layered quality of seeing through time rather than through space. He saw Winterfell. Not present-day Winterfell. Old Winterfell. The castle being built. The walls going up. Stone by stone. By men whose faces he could see, and whose names he didn't know, and who were building with a purpose that the building communicated even 8,000 years later. This castle is built against the cold. Not the winter cold. The other cold. The deep cold. The cold that had a face and a direction and an intention. He saw the wall. The wall being built. Not by men, by something else. By the specific combination of magic and labor that the histories called the works of the children and the first men, and that the seeing revealed to be larger, more deliberate. The wall was not a defense built by men who were afraid. The wall was an engineering project built by men who had defeated an enemy, and who understood that defeating an enemy and eliminating an enemy were different achievements, and that the wall was the infrastructure of the second achievement being deferred because the second achievement required resources that the first had consumed. He saw the Night King, not up close, not in the specific dramatic confrontation that the prophecies describe, from a distance, through the weirwoods, through the specific green and gold lens of the sight, through the filtered perception that the old gods provided, because the unfiltered perception would have been Bran understood this instinctively too much. The Night King was not a man. The Night King was a system. A presence, a cold intelligence that operated on timescales that made human lifetimes look like heartbeats, and that was, in the specific way that the sight allowed Bran to perceive it, patient. Patient and building. The army of the dead was not a static force. The army was growing. Every year, every decade, the cold producing more of the dead accumulating the way snow accumulated in drifts slowly, continuously, building toward a quantity that would overwhelm the wall not through force, but through sheer mass. Bran saw this. He was 7 years old, and he saw the mathematics of an extinction event building beyond the wall, with the specific patient inevitability of a glacier advancing. He told Luwin. Because Luwin was the person in Winterfell whose response to information was analytical rather than emotional, and because the information Bran was carrying required analysis before it required action. Luwin listened. Luwin had been listening to Bran's visions for months, and the listening had produced a specific maester's response. Not belief exactly, not disbelief either, but the intermediate state of the data is anomalous, and the anomaly is consistent, and consistency deserves investigation. The army of the dead, growing, every year. The Watch can't see it, because the Watch sends rangers, and the rangers die, and the dying adds to the army. Bran was sitting in Luwin's chambers, on the chair that was too big for him, with his feet not touching the floor because he was 7, and the chair was built for adults. The wall holds, for now. But the army it's growing faster than the wall's capacity to hold it. You see this through the trees. Through the trees. Through the old things. The magic that's in the weirwoods, and in the wall, and in the Bran, searched for the word. The network. The trees are connected, like roots underground. They all see the same things. And the seeing is old. The trees have been seeing the army grow for 8,000 years. Luwin sat with this. He sat with it the way maesters sat with things the chain around his neck, holding the weight of 5 years of study and the specific institutional conservatism that the Citadel produced in its graduates. The Citadel said, magic is historical. Magic is gone. The world operates on natural principles, and the supernatural is a category error. The data said otherwise. Tell your mother, Luwin said, and your mother needs to tell your father. Father knows about the Queen, the arrest. Your father needs to know about the army. The army is Luwin looked at the ceiling. The army is the larger problem. The succession crisis is political. The army is existential. What's existential? It means the difference between a problem that changes who rules and a problem that changes whether anyone is alive to be ruled. Bran looked at Luwin with the grey eyes that were seeing things that maesters were trained to believe were impossible. That's a big word. It's a big problem. Catelyn wrote to Ned again. The letter was longer this time, denser, carrying the specific weight of a mother who was watching her 7-year-old son develop abilities that the maesters said were impossible, and that the North said were possible, and that the evidence said were real. The letter said, the visions are getting stronger. Bran sees the army beyond the wall. The army is growing. The Night's Watch cannot contain it. Whatever you're doing in King's Landing, the arrest, the trial, the politics need to produce a realm that can respond to what's coming from the North. Not next year. Not next decade. The response needs to start now. Your son sees the future, Ned, and the future is coming south. Akiwandam, the trial. 299 AC. The trial of Cersei Lannister and Jaime Lannister was the most significant judicial proceeding in the Seven Kingdoms since the Dance of the Dragons. Tywin came. He came with 200 men, the limit that Stannis had set, and the specific Tywin energy of a man who had been managing crises for 40 years and who intended to manage this one. He came not as a defendant's father, but as the Lord of Casterly Rock, which was a distinction that Tywin maintained with the specific rigid discipline of a man who understood that the distinction was his only available position. The trial was conducted by a panel of 7 judges, a number chosen for its religious significance and its practical utility, 7 being enough to prevent the verdict from depending on a single corrupt juror, and small enough to prevent the proceeding from becoming a parliament. The judges, Ned as Hand, Stannis as the king's brother, Mace Tyrell as Lord Paramount of the Reach, Jon Arryn's replacement as Lord of the Vale, a Royce selected by the council after Lysa's refusal to participate, Renly Baratheon as another Prince of the Blood, a representative from the faith, and Doran Martell, who had travelled from Sunspear for the occasion with the specific Dornish interest of a man whose family had been connected to Lannister crimes before, and who wanted to witness justice being applied to the family that had escaped it for 20 years. Cersei denied everything. This was expected. Cersei denied with the specific ferocity of a woman who understood that the denial was her only weapon, and who was going to wield the weapon until the weapon broke, or until the denying was overcome by evidence that the denial couldn't counter. The evidence was presented. The lineage book. The bastards. The testimony of servants. 3 servants from the Red Keep who had seen things and who were willing, under the specific protection that the trial offered, to testify about what they'd seen. The testimony was not graphic. The judges had agreed that the testimony would describe patterns and observations rather than explicit acts, because the explicit would have turned the trial into spectacle, and spectacle was what the trial was specifically designed to avoid. Jaime's defense was different from Cersei's. Jaime did not deny. This was the surprise, the thing that nobody expected, that Tywin had not authorized, that the legal advisors Tywin had hired for the defense had specifically counseled against. Jaime stood in the trial chamber, and he did not deny. "I love my sister," Jaime said. "I've loved her since before I knew what the word meant in the specific way that applies here. The love is the truth. The children are mine. The denial is a performance, and I'm done performing." The chamber went still. Tywin's face. The mask. The 40-year mask. The mask held. But behind the mask, visible to anyone who knew where to look, and several people in the room knew where to look, something was happening. Not collapse. Not emotion. The specific Tywin response to a variable that he had not planned for, and that his planning could not accommodate. His son had confessed. His son had, in the specific language of legal proceeding, confirmed every charge against them with the simple, devastating efficiency of a man who was tired of the lie, and who had chosen, in the most public possible venue, to stop carrying it. Cersei screamed at him. In the chamber. In front of the judges. The specific Cersei loss of control that happened when someone she depended on deviated from the script she'd written. The script that said, deny, deny, deny. And the deviation destroyed the script. You can't. You're destroying. I'm telling the truth. For the first time in 17 years. Jaime looked at her. It's lighter than I expected. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty. On all charges. The confession made the verdict a formality. A formality that the judges conducted with the specific solemn efficiency that the proceedings required. The ritual of institutional justice being applied to a crime that everyone had known about and that nobody had been willing to name until the naming was forced by a man who discovered a book and a boy who saw through a tree. The sentencing was negotiated. This was the Tywin contribution, not the denial was destroyed. The negotiation. Tywin's legal team, operating now on the assumption of guilt rather than the assumption of innocence, shifted from defense to mitigation. The mitigation argument was, the children are innocent. Whatever the parents did, the children did not choose their parents. Punish the parents. Spare the children. Ned agreed. This was the Ned contribution, the moral architecture that said, the children are not the crime. The children are people. Bastards, yes. Illegitimate, yes, no longer heirs to the throne, certainly, but alive. Safe, with a future that was not defined by their parents' choices. The sentence, Cersei was confined, not executed. The judges debated execution, and Ned argued against it because Ned did not believe in executing women for crimes of passion. And because the execution of a woman, any woman, even Cersei Lannister, would produce a martyrdom that the Lannister propaganda machine would exploit for decades. Confinement, in the Maiden Vault, historical, secure. The specific institutional confinement that said you are removed from power without saying you are removed from life. Jaime was removed from the Kingsguard, stripped of the white cloak, sent to Casterly Rock not as lord, as resident. Tywin's son returned to Tywin's house, diminished but alive. The children were legitimized as Lannisters, not Baratheons. The Baratheon name was stripped, the Lannister name attached. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen Lannister. Children of Jaime and Cersei. No claim to the throne, no claim to Storm's End, no claim to anything except the Lannister name, and whatever Tywin chose to do with the heirs he now officially had. Stannis was named heir to the Iron Throne. Robert, whose response to the trial had been the specific Robert response of drinking heavily and speaking rarely, and radiating a grief that was visible to everyone, and that Robert refused to acknowledge, signed the document. Stannis was the heir. The succession was secured. The realm held. Not without cracks. The Westerlands were furious. Tywin was calculating. The Tyrells were repositioning. And the specific political landscape of a kingdom that had just changed its succession through a trial rather than a war was volatile in ways that would take years to stabilize. But the realm held. Nobody died. This was the thing. The specific, remarkable, almost miraculous divergence from the other version of this story. Nobody died. The truth came out through a book and a boy and a trial. And the truth was ugly, and the response was institutional. And the institution held, and the holding meant no war, no red wedding, no battle of the Blackwater, no burning of the Riverlands, no assassination of a king, a trial, a verdict, a transition, the most boring possible outcome and the most valuable. Brand the Calling, 299 bit. In Winterfell, Bran Stark was 8 years old, and the three-eyed crow was getting louder. Not the dreams. The dreams had stabilized into a rhythm that Bran had learned to manage, the way you managed weather. You couldn't control it. You could dress for it. The loudness was different. A call. A direction. The specific, insistent pull of something north that wanted him closer, and that was communicating the wanting through the Weirwood network that Bran had been tapping into for a year. Come north, not heard. Felt. In the bones. In the blood, in the specific deep body register that the site operated in, and that was not language, but was clearer than language, because language could lie, and the blood couldn't. Bran stood in the Godswood and felt the pull and thought about what it meant. He was 8. He was not going north. He was a child in a castle with a mother who had told him not to climb towers, and who would, he could predict this with absolute certainty, not allow him to ride north of the wall, to follow a feeling in his blood. But the pull was real. The pull was getting stronger. And the visions, the deep visions, the ones that showed the army growing beyond the wall, the visions were getting more urgent. The mathematical progression that Lewin had helped him calculate the rate of growth of the dead, the diminishing capacity of the watch. The specific timeline that the data produced the timeline said. Years. Not decades, years. Bran needed help. Not the kind of help that adults provided, the institutional help, the armies and the logistics and the political management that his father was doing in King's Landing, and that was necessary, and that was also, in the specific assessment of a child who could see through trees, insufficient. The institutional response was too slow. The institutional response operated on the timeline of politics, and the timeline of politics was measured in months and years, and the timeline of the threat was measured in. Bran could feel this, could see the shape of it through the sight. The timeline of the threat was accelerating. He needed the other help. The help that the three-eyed crow was offering. The help that was north, beyond the wall, in the specific place that the pull was pointing toward. The help that was training. Not sword training. Not maester training. The training that the site required, the deep training. the specific education in how to use the gift that was developing inside him, and that he was currently using the way a child used a tool designed for an adult, clumsily, with approximation rather than precision. He wrote to his father. The letter was Bran's handwriting, was still 7-year-old handwriting, the letters large and uneven, and carrying the specific effortful quality of a child who was forming words with the hand that hadn't finished developing the motor control for the task. Father, I need to go north. Not to the wall. Past it. There's something calling me. Through the trees. The three-eyed crow. I know what it is now. It's a person. Or it was a person. It's been in the trees for a long time, and it's been waiting for someone who can hear it, and I can hear it, and it needs me to come. The army is growing. You know this. Mother told you, but you don't know how fast. I can see how fast. It's faster than you think. The watch can't hold it. The wall can, for now. But the response needs to be everything. All of it. Every man. Every piece of dragonglass. Every weapon. And the response needs the thing that the three-eyed crow has, which is the knowledge. The specific knowledge of how to fight this that has been lost since the first men, and that is waiting in a cave, north of the wall, for someone to come learn it. I'm the someone. I know I'm 8. I know you're going to say no. Tell Mother I'm sorry. Tell her I went because the tree told me to, and the tree hasn't been wrong yet. He didn't send the letter. He went. Not alone. Bran was 8 and not stupid. He went with Hodor, who went where Bran went because Hodor's world was organized around the people he cared about, and Bran was the primary person. He went with Summer, the direwolf, who had been his since the litter, who was growing faster than direwolves were supposed to grow, and who had the specific quality of an animal connected to something larger than an animal, the warging bond that Bran was developing alongside the green sight, and that tied him to the wolf in ways that were not metaphor, but physiology. He went north, not to the wall, past it, through the gate at the night fort that he found because the weirwoods showed him where the gate was, the black gate, the ancient passage that was not on any map, and that opened for Bran because the gate recognized the blood and the sight, and the specific quality of a child who was authorized to pass by something older than the gate itself. He went into the north, into the cold, into the trees. He found the cave. The cave. What Bran learned. 299 AC. The three-eyed crow was a man, or had been a man. The distinction was, Bran stood in the cave with Hodor behind him and Summer at his side, and looked at the figure on the throne of weirwood roots, and the figure was simultaneously the most human and the least human thing he had ever seen. Old. Ancient, the body woven into the roots the way thread was woven into cloth. The distinction between the person and the tree no longer clear, because the distinction had been dissolving for 100 years. Eyes open, one of them. The third eye. The eye that saw what the other eyes couldn't, that looked through the weirwood network and across time, and that was, in this cave. In this specific ancient place, connected to everything. You came. The voice was not the voice of a person. The voice of a network speaking through a person. The specific acoustic quality of words produced by a mouth that was more tree than man, and that communicated in a register that was underneath language. I came. You're young. I'm 8. Too young. But the time is the time. The waiting can't continue. The man told Bran what the man was. Brynden Rivers, Bloodraven, a Targaryen bastard who had lived 150 years, and who had been in this cave for most of them, connected to the weirwoods, watching the realm through the roots, maintaining the specific ancient vigil that someone had been maintaining since the long night, and that demanded a successor, because the vigil could not end, and the man maintaining it was ending. You have the sight. I know. You have the sight stronger than anyone I've felt in 100 years. The blood is right. The Stark blood, and the First Men blood, and the specific combination that produces the channel. The old man's eye focused on Bran. The channel is what matters, not the person. The channel is what the trees need, a mind that can receive what the trees see, and that can process the seeing into action. Action. The army is growing. You've seen it. The Night King is building his force. The wall holds for now. But the wall was never meant to hold forever. The wall was meant to hold until the realm was ready to fight. The realm has spent 8,000 years not being ready. The eye closed. Opened. You're going to make them ready. How? By seeing. By showing. By being the bridge between the Weirwood network and the people who need to know what the network knows. Bloodraven looked at Bran. You cannot fight the army. You cannot command the army that fights the army. You are not a warrior. You are an eye. The eye that sees the battlefield from above and that tells the commanders where to move and when to move and what they're facing. The eye in the sky. Bran thought about this. He was 8 years old, and he was being told that his purpose, the specific reason that the green sight had chosen him, had manifested in him, had been calling to him since the three-eyed crow first appeared in his dreams, was not to be a hero, but to be a tool. An instrument. The eye that saw the battlefield. He thought, from the rooftops. He thought, the view from the top makes the world make sense. He thought, I couldn't fly with wings. He told me to fly with eyes. And this is what flying with eyes looks like, not soaring above the world like a bird, but seeing the world from above like a map. Seeing the connections between the parts. Seeing the shape of the thing. He thought, this is what I was born for. Not the climbing, the seeing. How long does the training take? Long enough, not years, months. The channel is natural. The training is refinement. My parents don't know I'm here. Your parents will know. Your mother will. The old man's mouth twitched. Something that might have been humor in a face that had mostly forgotten humor. Your mother will be extremely unhappy. She'll come looking. She'll send people looking. You'll be found by them, by the watch, by the network of people who are connected to you through the sight. The eye focused. The finding is part of the process. The finding brings the people who need to know about the threat to the place where the threat is visible. And the visibility is what produces the response. Bran sat down in the cave. He sat with the old man and the weirwood roots and the specific ancient weight of a place that had been maintaining a vigil for 8,000 years and that was now transferring the vigil to a boy who had been alive for 8 years and who was constitutionally incapable of sitting still. Okay, Bran said. Teach me. Bloodraven taught him. The teaching was not dramatic, not the mystical montage that stories produced when magic was being transferred, not fire and ice, and the dramatic revelation of power. The teaching was more like Bran would describe it later, in letters that his mother would read with the specific mixture of terror and pride that Catelyn applied to everything involving her children. The teaching was more like learning to use a muscle you didn't know you had. The sight was there. It had always been there. The training was about learning to flex it deliberately rather than accidentally, to direct the seeing rather than receive it, to choose what the weirwoods showed him rather than being shown whatever the weirwoods wanted to show. He learned to see the present, not just King's Landing and Winterfell, but everywhere the weirwoods reached, which was everywhere in the north and most of the south, and the specific patchwork of old forest that still existed in a realm that had been cutting down its weirwoods for centuries. He learned to see the past not as stories, but as experience, the specific immersive quality of the sight when it was directed backward in time. The ability to stand in a moment from 1,000 years ago and perceive it as if it were happening now. He learned to see the threat, the Night King, the army, the specific tactical configuration of the enemy force that was building beyond the wall. Not the details. The sight didn't show him individual dead, didn't produce a roster, but the shape, the direction, the numbers, the specific strategic picture that a commander needed to plan a defense. He learned to communicate not through ravens, not through letters, but through the weirwoods themselves, the specific ability to place information in the network and have the information received by someone at the other end who was listening. Not many people listened. The skill was rare. But the few who did, the greenseers, the sensitives, the specific small population of people in the north who had the old blood strongly enough to hear the trees, the communication reached them. He spent 3 months in the cave. When he emerged, he was different. Not changed the way that falls change people, not broken and rebuilt. Changed the way that learning changed people, the same person with more tools, the same architecture with more rooms. The specific expansion that happened when a mind discovered it was larger than it had thought. He went south. He went back through the Black Gate and back to the wall, and he arrived at Castle Black on a morning in late spring, and the watch garrison which had been told by Raven from Winterfell that Lord Stark's youngest son had disappeared north of the wall, and that a search was underway. The watch garrison received him with the specific combined relief and confusion of men who had been looking for a missing child and who found, instead, a boy who didn't look lost. Catelyn arrived at the wall a week later. She arrived with Robb and 20 men and the specific controlled fury of a mother who had received a letter from her 8-year-old son explaining that he was going beyond the wall because a tree told him to, and who had spent 3 months in the specific maternal hell of not knowing where her child was, and who was now standing at Castle Black, oscillating between the relief of finding him alive and the rage of what he'd done. Bran, mother, I can explain. The word was ice. Explain. You went beyond the wall. You are 8 years old. You went beyond the wall with Hodor and a wolf, and in the three-eyed I don't care about crows. I care about the fact that my 8-year-old son went beyond the wall without permission, without she stopped, breathing hard. The specific Catelyn control reasserting itself, the discipline that said, feel the rage, don't perform it. Feel it and hold it, and use it when it's useful. What I learned later. What you learned is later. What you did is now, and what you did is necessary. The word stopped her, not the word itself the way Bran said it, not the voice of an 8-year-old defending an impulsive decision. The voice of someone who had spent 3 months learning to see the world from above and who understood, not believed. Understood that the thing he had done was the thing that needed doing. The army is real. Mother, I've seen it. Not in dreams in the sight, through the trees, with the training. The army is 200,000 dead. Growing every day. Moving south. The wall holds for now. In 3 years the wall fails. The army comes south. If the realm is not prepared, if the preparation doesn't start now, the realm ends. Catelyn looked at her son. She looked at the 8-year-old boy who was standing in front of her with dirt on his face, and the specific uncanny composure of someone who had been through something that aged the mind without aging the body. 3 years. 3 years. Maybe 4. The timeline is approximate. The sight shows the trajectory, not the clock. And the preparation? Dragonglass, from Dragonstone. The obsidian deposits, they're massive. Enough to arm every soldier in the 7 kingdoms. Valyrians steal the existing swords, redistributed, the watch reinforced. Not 1,000 men. 10,000. 20. Enough to man every castle on the wall. That's the realm would have to mobilize. All of it. Every kingdom. Every house. The specific total commitment that the first men made 8,000 years ago, and that the realm has spent 8,000 years forgetting. Catelyn looked at Robb. Robb looked at Bran. Robb's face was doing the specific thing that Robb's face did when he encountered something that challenged his understanding, not denial, not acceptance. Assessment, the Robb process of taking in new information and building a response that accounted for the new. We need father, Robb said. We need everyone, Bran said. Father, Stannis, the Tyrells. Dorne, the Iron Islands. Everyone, Bran. You're 8, I know how old I am. He held Robb's gaze with the grey eyes that had been seeing things that 15-year-olds couldn't see, and that the seeing had changed in ways that the changing hadn't made visible, but that the looking could feel. I'm also the only person alive who can see the army, who can show the lords what's coming, who can be the eye that tells the commanders where to fight. Catelyn sat down. She sat on a bench at Castle Black in the northern cold with her youngest son standing in front of her, telling her that the world was ending in 3 years, and that the ending could be prevented through the specific total mobilization of a realm that was currently consumed by a succession crisis, and that was not, by any available assessment, ready to hear that the real crisis was not who sat on the throne, but whether there would be a realm for the throne to govern. She thought about Ned. She thought about the letter she was going to write. The specific, impossible letter that said, "Our son went beyond the wall because a tree told him to, and he came back with the ability to see through time and space, and the intelligence he's carrying says, we have 3 years before an army of the dead ends the world." She thought, how do you write that letter? She thought, you write it honestly, the way you write everything, and you trust that the person reading it knows you well enough to know you wouldn't write it unless it was true. She wrote the letter. She wrote it that night at Castle Black, in a room that smelled like cold stone and old fire. She wrote it with the specific, careful hand of a woman who was choosing every word because every word carried the weight of credibility, and credibility was the only currency she had. She sent it south. And in King's Landing, in a realm that had just survived a succession crisis without a war, the letter arrived like a second earthquake. Different from the first, deeper, the kind that changed not the surface, but the foundation. Ned read it. He read it twice. He went to Stannis. What if Bran Stark never fell from the tower? He stayed on the ground. That's it. That's the whole divergence. A 7-year-old boy obeyed his mother, not because he wanted to, not because he'd learned caution, but because the specific geometry of a Tuesday afternoon put Catelyn in the courtyard and Bran on the path to the broken tower. And the interception happened before the climbing, and the climbing didn't happen. He didn't see Jaime and Cersei. He didn't fall. He wasn't pushed. He wasn't broken. He was fine. He was a boy who climbed trees and annoyed his mother and trained in the yard, and who had, without any trauma, without any catastrophe, the green sight, the gift that was in the blood, the gift that the blood was going to express, regardless of whether the expression was invited, because the old gods didn't need a broken boy. They needed a connected one. The connection came through the trees, not through a fall, and because the connection came without the fall, everything else changed. Catelyn didn't arrest Tyrion. Ned didn't lose his head. The war didn't start. The realm didn't burn. The Starks didn't scatter. The Red Wedding didn't happen. The specific cascade of horrors that started with a boy falling from a tower, and that consumed the lives of thousands of people, didn't happen because the boy didn't fall. Instead, a trial. A legal proceeding. The ugliest truth in the 7 kingdoms, exposed through evidence and testimony rather than through war. A succession crisis managed through institutional process rather than through blood. And underneath it all, underneath the politics and the trial and the transition, a boy in a godswood, sitting with a tree, learning to see. The green sight didn't need trauma. The green sight needed attention. The specific, quiet attention of a child sitting still and listening to something older than language, and older than the castle, and older than the family that built the castle. Something that had been waiting in the weirwoods for 8,000 years for a child who would listen. Bran listened, and the listening saved the world. Not through prophecy, not through destiny, discovering that parents through the specific, mundane, domestic miracle of a mother catching her son in a court. Your father wants you cleaned up before King Robert arrives. The smallest moment, Bran went inside. The largest consequence. He almost climbed on that Tuesday. A tower the king he didn't come from. The whole castle was in motion because a the specific, organized chaos of a household preparing for a royal visit. For once, the cleaning, for the cooking, and the grooming of horses and children that happened when